In medieval times, justice meant burning, branding and beheading, sometimes for stealing a loaf of bread. Think your Monday was rough? Try surviving court with a tongue clamp. Think your life's rough? Try living in a world where sneezing during church could earn you a whipping and stealing a loaf of bread might cost you your entire hand. In medieval Europe, justice wasn't about fairness. It wasn't even about guilt or innocence. It was about survival spectacle and satisfying some deeply bored villagers with a thirst for public violence. If you think getting a parking ticket is brutal, imagine being boiled alive for coin forgery. Back then, justice was more like a horror-themed talent show. You could be judged by a group of unwashed villagers who believed the moon was a witch's eye. The courtroom was sometimes a literal field. The judge was drunk and evidence. That was just a fancy word for whatever the loudest guy said. And the loudest guy was usually holding an axe. Fairness didn't live there. Fear did. And fear wore a robe and carried a very sharp knife. Let's set the stage. You're a poor peasant in 1327. You've just been accused of stealing a chicken. It doesn't matter that you didn't do it. The Baron's nephew said you looked shifty, and now you're standing in a town square surrounded by strangers with pitchforks and suspicious grins. Your trial is basically a warm-up act for someone's beheading. You'll be lucky to make it out with both feet still attached. Medieval justice wasn't blind. She was blindfolded, yes, but only because she'd just been spun in a circle, handed a sword, and told to hit whatever moved. Laws varied from town to town like weird regional pizza toppings. What got you hanged in York might get you a slap on the wrist in Paris, or a branding iron to the face in Prague. Consistency was for monks and bread recipes, not justice. And forget about presumption of innocence. In medieval times, if someone accused you, it was pretty much your job to prove God liked you enough to save you. Trials often involved ordeals, walk across hot coals, carry burning iron, or survive being thrown into a river. If you didn't scream, you were innocent. If you did scream, well, congratulations. You just failed the divine customer service test. Imagine someone tosses you into a freezing river tied up like laundry and says, if you float, you're a witch. If you sink, you're innocent, but also dead. That's medieval logic. Your best case scenario was dying as a good Christian. Worst case, living as a condemned heretic. Either way, bring a towel and maybe a priest. This wasn't justice. It was performance art with blood. Townsfolk would gather like it was market day. Children got front row seats to public floggings. Vendors sold snacks near the gallows. You think today's true crime podcasts are dark? Try watching your neighbour get skinned alive because someone claimed she whispered to a frog. And no, we're not making this up. Historical records show that public executions were scheduled and advertised in advance, complete with musical performances and drunk jesters. Imagine getting a flyer that reads, "Come see William. The baker get disemboweled. Half-price ale for kids." Nothing says family fun like watching intestines unravel on cobblestones. The irony. Most people didn't even understand the laws they were being punished under. Because plot twist, they couldn't read. Laws were written in Latin or French, depending on which flavour of oppressive regime you were under. The average peasant had the legal knowledge of a turnip. But that didn't stop them from being found guilty of crimes like wearing a hat too nice for their status. Ah yes, sumptuary laws. Because justice didn't stop at murder and theft, it reached into your wardrobe. If you wore silk as a peasant, that was seen as social treason. It was considered criminal to eat certain fish or wear certain colours unless you had the right noble blood. So if you were poor and stylish, the gallows had a spot with your name on it. Even animals weren't safe. Pigs, cows, and even insects were put on trial. A pig that trampled a child might be dressed in a little jacket and prosecuted for murder. Judges would solemnly read charges, witnesses testified against the pig, and yes, sentences were carried out. Sometimes the pig got hanged, sometimes it got excommunicated. It's unclear which was worse. If you're laughing, you're not alone. Historians have also found these stories ridiculous, but they're all real. And they tell us something deeply uncomfortable. Justice wasn't about truth. It was about control, about fear, about spectacle, and about reminding everyone who held the power, usually someone holding a very large sword. And just when you think it can't get more absurd, enter the concept of trial by combat. Can't decide who's guilty? No problem. Let's just have the two parties beat the hell out of each other in front of a cheering crowd. The winner must be innocent because God would never let the guilty party win. Unless, of course, God was busy that day. This system heavily favoured the strong, the rich and the well-armed. So if you were a 60-year-old widow accused of witchcraft by a knight, your odds were somewhere between horrible and bring a coffin. But sometimes, just sometimes, underdogs won. And those rare victories, they became legend. Not because they were just, but because they were hilariously improbable. Now let's be fair. Not everything was blood and torture. Occasionally you'd get off with just a branding iron or some delightful public humiliation. Stocks and pillories were like medieval timeout, except instead of your mum, it was a drunk town crowd throwing rotten onions at your head for 6 hours. Charming, really. The real kicker. People loved this system, or at least they tolerated it, because it was better than chaos. The laws, as cruel as they were, brought predictability, sort of like the weather. You couldn't stop it, but at least you knew which days might end with someone's hand nailed to a door. And here's the kicker. We still use phrases like the long arm of the law, which back then might literally mean a severed arm on a pike outside the courthouse. Justice was physical, visceral, no fancy legalese, just immediate, brutal consequences. Swift justice didn't mean fast paperwork, it meant you screamed before sunset. So yes, complain about modern bureaucracy all you like. Moan about jury duty. Yell at traffic tickets. But remember, you're not being crushed under a spiked wheel while a bishop chants psalms over your bleeding body. That's progress. Medieval justice reminds us of how far we've come, and how messed up our foundations really were. Our ancestors built legal systems while drunk on fear, superstition and wine, and they passed those systems down brick by brick like a bloody game of telephone. Some of that madness still echoes today. It's in the prisons, in the courtrooms, and in the ridiculous notion that pain, truth, the truth, pain doesn't equal guilt. But in medieval times, pain was the only witness that mattered. You confessed when you screamed. You were believed when you bled. Your innocence was proven by survival or your corpse. And if you couldn't afford a sword, a bribe, or a very good excuse, well, the executioner always showed up on time. So welcome to the dark circus of medieval justice. Grab your ale, put on your iron collar, and get ready to watch the wheels of justice turn slowly, loudly, and over someone's spine. Next stop, a front row seat to the spectacle of execution. If you ever thought the justice system today feels like a joke, medieval Europe would respond, hold my mead. Because back then the law wasn't just a mess. It was a flaming dung cart of confusion, superstition and sadism, disguised as divine will. Judges wore robes not because it was dignified, but because it was easier to hide bloodstains. You want logic too bad. Medieval law was just a mix of fear, fire, and whatever made the peasants scream loudest. Let's talk about trial by ordeal, which sounds like a reality TV show for psychopaths, but was actually a very real method of determining guilt. If someone accused you of a crime, and the court, by which we mean some sweaty guy in a hat, couldn't decide the truth, you were thrown into the arms of God's judgment. Spoiler. God didn't usually show up. You were expected to either survive boiling water, carry red-hot iron bars, or plunge your arm into a fire and come out unharmed. Because that's how you know someone's innocent, right? If their flesh doesn't bubble like stew. One popular favourite was the ordeal by boiling water. You dip your hand in a cauldron of bubbling liquid and fish out a stone from the bottom. Then they'd wrap your hand in cloth and check it 3 days later. If it healed, God loved you. If it festered, sorry. You're guilty, and probably already halfway to execution. The only thing you proved was that third-degree burns don't care about justice. Another delightful pastime was the ordeal by hot iron. You'd carry a burning hot metal bar for several paces, and if your hand didn't look like roast pork 3 days later, congratulations, you were declared innocent. Of course, nobody told the iron. It didn't care how pious you were. It just burned. Equal opportunity suffering. You might think the point was pain, but actually the point was theatre. Pain was just the intermission act. For those who enjoyed swimming, there was ordeal by water. But don't grab your floaties just yet. The logic went like this: water is pure. So if it rejected you, i.e. you floated, it meant you were in league with the devil. If you sank, you were pure, and also probably drowned. Either way, your trial ended in soaking wet trauma. That's medieval law lose-lose with a side of hypothermia. If the accused was lucky, red rich, they might get trial by combat instead. This was basically letting people punch their way through legal disputes like a bad episode of medieval UFC. The idea was simple. Let God decide who's right by allowing the two parties to beat the hell out of each other with swords, maces, or bare fists. Because divine intervention clearly favours the guy with better upper body strength. It's all very spiritual. Imagine this: you accuse your neighbour of stealing your goat. He challenges you to a duel. You show up with a pitchfork and a limp. He shows up with chainmail and rage issues. Congratulations. You just turned a livestock dispute into a death match. Even worse, sometimes old women or frail peasants had to appoint champions to fight for them. Hope you had friends, or at least someone you hadn't insulted that week. And let's not forget, some of these fights were to the death, like full gladiator mode. There are records of people fighting until one guy bled out in a ditch, while the crowd cheered like it was half-time at a football game. In some cases, they'd throw both parties into a pit and let them smash each other with clubs until the winner crawled out or didn't. If this sounds like madness, remember it was legally sanctioned madness. Why did they believe this worked? Because they thought God would protect the innocent. That's it. That was the whole argument. No evidence, no witnesses, just let's see who gets maimed less. And that person must be telling the truth. It's like letting a coin toss decide a murder trial, except the coin is on fire and screams when you flip it. The worst part, people actually believed it. Villagers stood by, nodding solemnly as a guy with third-degree burns was declared guilty. Because in their minds, this was justice. This was God's will. Never mind that 90% of the people who underwent these ordeals ended up dead, maimed, or mentally destroyed. That's not injustice, that's divine filtering. And just in case you thought it couldn't get any darker, let me introduce you to the idea of ordeal by bread and cheese. Sounds tasty, right? Except in this trial, the accused had to eat a chunk of holy bread and cheese, while a priest prayed for divine judgment. If they choked even slightly, guilty. If they swallowed, clean, innocent. So yes, a dry throat could literally kill you. Imagine standing in front of a judge desperately trying not to cough while a hunk of stale cheese scrapes down your esophagus. Someone whispers a prayer. Your palms are sweating. You hiccup. Boom! You're now a heretic and they're lighting the pyre. Justice by dairy. A lactose intolerant's worst nightmare. There were even worse outcomes for those accused of heresy. These trials didn't end with burning hands. They ended with burning bodies. The church didn't play around. Speak one word too many against doctrine, and suddenly you're tied to a stake, while an audience sings hymns and watches you become toast. And not the good crunchy kind. And for the record, there was no due process for heretics. The Inquisition could torture you until you confessed, even if you weren't guilty. In fact, confessing made it slightly better. They might strangle you before lighting the fire. A small mercy in a world where mercy wore spiked boots and smelled like scorched hair. Even for common crimes, punishments weren't designed to correct behaviour. They were designed to make an example of you. So people could say, don't steal apples unless you want your ears nailed to the town gate. It wasn't about justice, it was about spectacle. Pain was the advertisement, fear was the message. And you bet your roasted backside people remembered. Children learned quickly not to pickpocket, because they saw what happened to the last kid who did a public beating so severe he couldn't stand for days. This was justice, not as deterrent but as psychological warfare. Your mind was punished long before your body. Let's not forget the role of the executioner here. These were professional pain technicians. They studied anatomy not to save lives, but to end them with maximum impact. The ideal execution wasn't quick, it was memorable. Heads rolled, yes. But sometimes so did bowels, eyes, tongues. Justice wasn't just seen, it was heard, it screamed. Now imagine all of this functioning in a society where superstition was currency. If your crops failed, someone must be a thief. If your child got sick, your neighbour might be harbouring sin. Suddenly you're dragging people to court, not because they did something wrong, but because something went wrong and someone had to suffer for it. The law was a tool, yes, but not of truth. It was a club, a branding iron, a fire pit. And the punchline was always the same. If you were poor or unlucky, or just in the wrong place at the wrong plague, you burned. Innocence didn't matter. Truth didn't matter. What mattered was whether the mob got their entertainment and the system got its blood. What passed for legal philosophy back then was equal parts divine authority, social control, and maybe this'll shut the peasants up for a week. Kings and nobles didn't follow the same laws. Surprise justice didn't apply upward. It only punched downward. If a baron killed someone, he paid a fine. If a peasant stole bread, he lost a limb. And if you complained too loudly, you disappeared. Let's not pretend there were no records. The sad thing is we have plenty. Court cases involving women whipped for gossiping, men flayed alive for minor thefts, teenagers mutilated for sneaking out after curfew. It wasn't isolated. It was normal. Just another Tuesday. Your neighbour gets impaled. You go back to harvesting turnips. So the next time someone waxes poetic about the good old days, remind them those days included the iron chair. A lovely piece of furniture lined with spikes. You'd sit on it, and then they'd strap you in tighter and tighter. Each movement shredded skin, and the whole thing was preheated for your added discomfort. Justice in the medieval mind wasn't about what was fair. It was about what looked fair to a crowd with a torch in one hand and a turnip in the other. It was about spectacle over substance. And it was built on the belief that suffering purged sin, especially when that suffering was someone else's. Still think the law today is rough, you have no idea. At least now trials don't involve iron rods and a priest mumbling while you burn alive. At least now you can cough during court without dying. Back then the punchline to "Did you hear what happened to Henry?" was usually, "Yeah, they found his hands in the stew." In the Middle Ages the joke was always on you, unless you were the king or the bishop, or just lucky enough to choke quietly on the cheese. So you're standing in the middle of a muddy village square. You've been accused of stealing a goat, insulting the church, and just for fun looking suspiciously literate. Welcome to your trial. Don't expect a clean courtroom or a sober judge. Expect hay-spittle superstition and the sweet scent of fermented turnips. Because medieval justice wasn't a search for truth. It was a popularity contest with blood at the end. Let's start with the judge. Was he trained in law? Absolutely not. But he did once share a beer with the local lord, and that's basically the same thing, right? Sometimes it was the village reeve, sometimes the sheriff, sometimes a nobleman with a head full of wine and a heart full of boredom. These weren't men of reason. They were men of power, which in medieval Europe was far more dangerous. Imagine a judge who couldn't read, didn't know the charges, and was mostly guessing what crime even meant. That was normal. The job wasn't to find facts, it was to keep order whatever that meant on any given Tuesday. Justice was more about vibes than evidence. If the crowd booed when your name was mentioned, things were not looking good for you. If someone threw a cabbage, consider that your closing argument. Now let's talk about the jury. Today we think of a jury as 12 people too unlucky to get out of civic duty. Back then, it was a gang of villagers who maybe hated your family, owed your landlord a favour, or just wanted the spectacle to end in blood. They weren't impartial. They were pissed off drunk or both. And they were often your neighbours, because who better to judge you than the guy whose pig you accidentally stepped on last winter? There were no legal protections, no appeals, no due process, no innocent until proven guilty. It was guilty because someone said so, followed by, and now will prove it by hurting you, until God speaks through your blisters. If they liked you, you might walk away with a fine. If they didn't, they'd walk you straight to the pillory, the branding iron, or the grave. Witnesses. Sometimes. But forget about sworn testimony. Most of it was hearsay with a side of vengeance. If someone had a grudge, your crops grew better, your wife was prettier. Your dog barked too much, you might find yourself accused of heresy before breakfast. And if 3 people said it was true, that was practically divine proof. Forget facts. This was trial by rumour, and gossip was the executioner's best friend. But wait, it gets dumber. In some places they used oath helpers, people who swore you were innocent just because they liked you. Think of it like Yelp, but for crime. You'd round up 12 of your best pals and they'd say, yeah, he totally didn't murder that monk, he's a great guy. And that might be enough, unless your opponent had more friends. Then you were screwed. So who got justice-rich people? Nobles, clergy, people who could buy better friends, bigger bribes, or smoother words. The system didn't punish everyone equally. It punished the weak, the poor, the strange, and the unlucky. Sound familiar? That's not a coincidence. We still carry the rotting bones of this system in our shiny modern courtrooms. The church ran its own courts too. If you were clergy, or even could just pretend to be clergy, you might get benefit of clergy, which basically meant a softer punishment. All you had to do was read a verse from the Bible. That's it. Literacy, holiness, no execution. So criminals started memorising the one verse that saved their necks, Psalm 51. It was called the neck verse, and it literally spared lives. Think about that. Knowing one line of scripture could be the difference between flogging and burning. Now imagine a system where someone lives because they cheated a literacy test, while another dies because they hiccuped during a trial. That was medieval jurisprudence in a nutshell, absurd, theatrical and fatal. The crowd played a role too. Big one. If they didn't like you, the judge might hand down a harsher sentence just to avoid a riot. If they liked you, they might help you escape. They weren't spectators. They were a bloodthirsty Greek chorus that could sway the plot. So trials became shows. And the audience came ready to shout, throw food, and maybe sharpen the stakes. This gave rise to one of the most dangerous aspects of medieval law mob justice disguised as legal procedure. Trials weren't about fairness. They were about control. Make the crowd feel involved, keep them entertained, and remind them what happens when they step out of line. Justice wasn't blind. She was winking at the people holding pitchforks. And let's talk language barriers. England after the Norman conquest was a legal circus laws written in Latin, trials spoken in Norman French and peasants who only spoke Middle English. So the accused often had no idea what was being said about them. It's like being on trial in a foreign country where your translator is also your accuser. What did he say? He said you're guilty and also smell like fish. Oh, what happens when a system is that broken? People start using it for revenge. Have a dispute over land, accuse your neighbour of sorcery, want your ex out of town, claim they cursed your cow. The line between crime and convenience blurred. You didn't need proof, you needed nerve. And maybe a few witnesses who didn't mind lying under oath assuming there even was one. Torture made things worse. Once someone accused you, you could be tortured for a confession even if no one knew if the crime actually happened. And if you did confess, it didn't matter if it was under duress. That was seen as proof enough, because surely no one would say they were guilty unless it were true, right? Except they'd just been beaten with a stick the size of a wagon axle. And if you refused to confess, good luck. Some places used a practice called peine forte. Basically they'd pile heavy stones on your chest until your ribs snapped, or your will did. The idea was to force a plea. Guilty or not guilty, say one. But some people preferred death over lying. They were crushed to death in silence. That silence, it was considered noble, or at least quieter. Let's not ignore the theatrics. Judges sometimes wore elaborate robes and performed trials like stage plays. There were speeches, processions, readings from dusty books no one understood, all to give the illusion of order in a world built on chaos and coercion. People didn't trust the law, but they feared it, and that was enough to keep it running. You might ask, where were the lawyers? Well, unless you were a noble or very rich, you didn't have one. Most people represented themselves, which is a nice way of saying they got eaten alive. The other side might show up with trained advocates. You showed up with mud on your boots and panic in your eyes. Guess who won? And let's not forget the bribes. Oh yes, bribery was practically a legal strategy. Want your sentence reduced? Pay up. Want a witness to vanish? Pay more. Want the judge to forget that time you murdered a merchant that'll cost extra? But yes, it was doable. Money didn't just talk, it testified. Jury tampering was also common. Since juries were made of locals, it was easy to threaten or bribe them. Sometimes you didn't need to say a word, just sharpen a knife within earshot of their front door, or let a pig's head appear in their bed. Yes, medieval intimidation was very on brand. The only people safe from this chaos were those at the top. Nobles were tried in special courts, clergy in church courts. Kings weren't tried at all. They were God's representatives, and God, oddly enough, always thought they were innocent. Funny how that worked. But for the rest, the butcher, the baker, the terrified candlestick maker, justice was a lottery of pain. It depended on your luck, your allies, your enemies, and whether the judge had a hangover. It wasn't blind justice, it was blindfolded roulette. And most of the time the ball landed on death. So next time you complain about your jury duty summons, just remember at least no one's forcing you to prove your innocence by lifting a flaming sword in front of your boss's cousin while 12 drunk farmers throw onions at your face. That's real progress. Barely. Before there was Netflix, there was Deathflix, and trust me, the medieval version had no chill. You didn't stream it, you screamed it. If someone was getting executed, it wasn't just a legal event, it was entertainment, like a carnival, except instead of popcorn you got pickpocketed. And instead of a clown, there was a guy getting his intestines pulled out while everyone clapped. Executions were public for a reason. They weren't just punishment, they were messages. Graphic, bloody, unforgettable messages that said, "Don't mess with us," or "This will be your Tuesday." Authorities wanted you to see every drop of blood, every tear, every twitch. It wasn't justice, it was marketing by mutilation. And judging by the crowd sizes, it worked. Imagine this, the town crier yells. Execution today at noon. Suddenly people are skipping chores, grabbing kids, packing lunches. Vendors roll out carts selling meat pies and hot ale. It's a festival, except instead of music, there's screaming. And instead of dancing, there's a man being hanged while someone's grandma knits by the scaffold like it's a picnic. Some executions had front row seating. VIP gallows. Nobles would watch from raised platforms, shielding themselves from the stench of burning flesh with perfumed cloths. Meanwhile, peasants crammed into the mud below, fighting for a better view of someone's last breath. Humanity at its finest tragedy with tiered pricing. Let's go over some of the crowd favourite execution methods. First up, hanging, simple, portable, effective. But they didn't always get it right. Sometimes the drop wasn't long enough and the victim strangled, slowly twitching like a broken puppet. Sometimes it was too long and the head popped off like a cork. Either way, the audience loved it. Standing ovation meant someone died just right. Then there was beheading clean if you were lucky. But clean depended on the skill of the executioner, and most weren't exactly precision instruments. Some needed 2, 3, even 4 swings to get the job done. People would groan, laugh, even bet on how many chops it would take. And when the head finally dropped, the executioner would hold it up like a prize fish. Bonus points if the eyes still blinked. But for the true fans, nothing beat drawing and quartering. This was the medieval version of a blockbuster. The victim was tied to a wooden frame, dragged through the streets by a horse until half dead, then hanged until nearly dead, then cut down, then disemboweled, then chopped into 4 pieces. Oh, and their head got stuck on a spike for decoration. It was basically the season finale of Pain. Children were there, lots of them, laughing, pointing, asking questions like, "Mama, why is his belly on the ground?" Because education started early. What better way to teach morality than showing what happens when someone forges a coin? You don't need ethics class when your entire school field trip is a live dissection of a screaming criminal. Let's not skip over burning at the stake. This one had the most drama. Flames, smoke, agonised wails. It was a real crowd pleaser, used especially for heretics, witches, and anyone who annoyed the church on a Monday. Sometimes they'd use wet wood to make it last longer. Think about that. They engineered the fire to burn slowly so you'd suffer longer. Burning alive wasn't the punishment, it was the experience. Occasionally the victim would be mercifully strangled beforehand. But merciful in this context means someone breaks your neck a second before you catch fire. If the rope snapped, well, bonus suffering. The crowd didn't mind. They brought snacks, and the church made sure to preach a sermon mid-sizzle because nothing pairs with theology like human barbecue. Another hit breaking on the wheel. A big wooden cartwheel. They'd tie you down, then smash your limbs one by one with a heavy iron bar. If your bones didn't break all the way, they'd adjust them until they did. Then they'd thread your shattered body through the spokes like some grotesque human pretzel and leave you there to die over days. Crows loved it. So did the crowd. It wasn't just about the killing. It was about making it count. Executions were designed to be memorable so you'd carry the fear home with your cabbage and ale. You'd go to sleep hearing screams and wake up obeying the law. That was the point. The system didn't want remorse. It wanted submission. Don't think women got a pass. If anything, their executions had extra flair. Women convicted of high treason burned. Petty theft hanged. Gossiping branded, shamed, or worse. One poor woman was executed for nagging her husband. True story. Medieval justice now available in misogyny flavour. Some places even had execution quotas. Too many crimes got a clean house. Judges handed down death like party favours. The scaffold never stayed empty for long. Some towns had so many hangings they had to install gallows on wheels to roll them from village to village. Portable death now with added convenience. Let's talk about executioners, the real stars of the show. These guys were half butcher, half local celebrity. Kids feared them. Adults bribed them. They were necessary but despised like the medieval version of tax collectors. Often forced to live on the edge of town literally and socially. But when showtime came, everyone wanted a good performance. Some were famous. Some were so bad it became a public joke. One guy took 11 swings to behead a noble. The crowd almost turned on him. But when a good executioner stepped up, clean and precise applause, cheers, maybe even free drinks. If you're going to kill someone in front of 500 people, you better make it art. And the stagecraft. Oh, it was there. Drummers played before the execution. Banners flew. Sometimes the condemned would give a speech hoping to win sympathy or at least not get booed. Some begged, some cursed, a few cracked jokes. Gallows humour wasn't just a pun. It was the only thing you could control as you stared at your own doom. Occasionally people survived executions, hanged criminals cut down too early, burned victims who somehow lived, quartered men who didn't bleed out fast enough. These were considered signs from God. Sometimes they were spared. Sometimes they were executed again, just to be sure. Because mercy was a glitch in the Matrix, not a feature. The remains, oh, those weren't buried quietly. They were displayed on gates, bridges, towers, heads on spikes, bodies dangling in chains, intestines, bones, limbs, all arranged with artistic flair. You couldn't walk 5 miles without seeing a human version of "Don't do this." Today we post memes. Back then they posted corpses. Execution days were holidays in a way. You dressed up, took the family, laughed, ate, drank, and screamed. It was civic bonding through shared trauma. Remember that guy who got flayed last week? Oh yeah, my aunt was there. Got blood on her shoes. Normal conversation, normal life. Horror woven into routine. We like to think we're more civilised now. But let's not kid ourselves. Look at modern media, crime dramas, serial killer documentaries, YouTube autopsies. We still love watching people suffer, we just prefer it with HD and popcorn. The difference. In medieval times, they didn't pretend it was educational. It was openly brutal, proudly graphic, and horribly human. People weren't just numb to it. They expected it. If no one got executed that week, something felt off. Like skipping church, or running out of ale. Justice wasn't complete until someone screamed, preferably while on fire, covered in tar and missing half a jaw. And if the town didn't have someone to execute, no problem. Find someone, accuse a stranger, round up a beggar, blame a traveller. It didn't matter who. The spectacle had to go on. The people needed closure, or at least a good show before supper. Execution was a ritual, a warning, a performance. And deep down it was a mirror. It reflected what society believed about guilt, pain and control. The condemned weren't just punished. They were transformed into cautionary tales, etched into memory by smoke, blood and public tears. So next time you feel nostalgic about the good old days, remember this. Those days included children cheering as someone's organs hit the dirt. The past wasn't cleaner. It was louder, crueler, and weirdly festive. And in the Middle Ages, justice always had an audience. Let's get one thing straight. Nobody grows up thinking, you know what, I want to be the guy who chops off heads for a living. Unless you lived in medieval Europe. In that case, welcome to the glamorous and absolutely horrifying world of executioners, the people who turned killing into a profession and somehow still had to pay taxes. These weren't heroes. These weren't villains. These were just guys with axes and job security, which frankly is the most terrifying resume imaginable. Being an executioner wasn't a dream job. It was usually inherited or assigned as punishment. That's right. Sometimes if you committed a crime and were spared execution, your punishment was to become the executioner. Talk about irony. You go from almost dying to getting paid to make other people dead. It was like being sentenced to a lifetime subscription of medieval misery, and your first task is to kill your old roommate. Most executioners didn't volunteer. They were born into it like a family curse. You'd wake up one day, 10 years old, and your dad says, "Son, it's time you learned how to dislocate a spine properly. Happy childhood." Try practicing your swing on dead pigs while other kids chase butterflies. Your family might have been rich in coin, but socially you were radioactive. No one wanted to date the guy whose dad split skulls for a living. And yet executioners were weirdly important. Cities needed them. Without someone to carry out the verdict, justice became just angry shouting. So even if everyone hated the executioner, they tolerated him. Like mouldy bread or your least favourite cousin. They'd glare at him in the marketplace, then whisper, "Please make it quick," when it was their turn on the chopping block. Executioners were often feared isolated and well paid. They lived on the edges of towns, literally outside the walls, like monsters you couldn't kill. They weren't allowed in churches. Their children couldn't attend school with others, but they got perks, free housing tax exemptions, and sometimes all the leftover clothes from the condemned. Yep, nothing says hand-me-downs like wearing the boots of a guy who just got drawn and quartered. Despite the stigma, these guys had technical skills. You couldn't just swing wildly and hope for the best. A good executioner knew anatomy better than most doctors. He had to calculate angles, force bone density. If he botched the job, the crowd would turn. A clean beheading meant silence. A messy one meant flying vegetables and a serious career downgrade. Speaking of botched jobs, oh, they happened. One guy famously took 11 tries to behead his victim. Imagine being that poor soul kneeling there and hearing, "Oops, missed again." The crowd goes from excited to nauseated. The executioner's reputation sinks faster than a heretic in trial by river. Some victims had to beg to be finished. Others fainted mid-process. It wasn't just physical pain, it was psychological torment broadcast live. And the crowd, ruthless. They expected quality gore. If the axe didn't land with cinematic precision, they booed, jeered. Some even demanded refunds on their meat pies. A good executioner had to be part killer, part showman, part therapist for the dying. It wasn't just murder, it was performance art with arterial spray. Some executioners became local legends. The best were known for their mercy, fast kill, steady hands, even a soft word before the blade fell. They might pat the condemned on the shoulder, say a prayer, or whisper, "I'll make it quick." Those guys were revered in a deeply twisted way. They weren't liked, but they were respected. You wouldn't invite them to your wedding, but you'd definitely want them handling your decapitation. Others weren't so gentle. Some enjoyed it, got creative, added flair. There are records of executioners experimenting with new methods, burning pitch spikes under fingernails' red-hot pincers. Medieval innovation didn't just go into architecture. It went into turning humans into screaming science projects. Execution wasn't limited to criminals either. Kings, queens, and nobles had their own high-end version. They often got a sword instead of an axe, more dignified, they said. Also faster. The executioner wore fancy robes, maybe even gave a speech. The condemned might get a glass of wine beforehand. Death, but make it classy. Of course, the executioner had to kill everyone, friends, neighbours, teenagers, old women, the occasional talking pig on trial. No exceptions. You can't say, "Sorry I went to school with her." You had to smile, nod, and drive a blade through someone's neck while their sister watched. Then go home, eat dinner, and pretend the soup doesn't taste like regret. Some executioners developed coping mechanisms, drinking, isolation, dark humour. Others claimed they were just doing God's work, as if divine justice came with a side of splattered brain matter. A few even kept journals detailing each kill with the precision of a baker logging loaves. Tuesday, 2 thieves, 1 witch. Clean cuts, mark it afterward. Casual genocide scribbled between breakfast and errands. And don't forget they did more than executions. They also handled torture amputations, public floggings and branding. They were like the Swiss Army knife of medieval agony. If something needed to be removed from a body, finger, eye, soul, they were your guy. You got a crime, they brought the tools. Their belt looked like a nightmare toolbox, spikes, hooks, blades, hammers. All wiped clean with the tears of last week's heretic. Despite it all, executioners had families. Wives, children, little cottages with flower pots and blood-stained aprons on the line. Kids who played tag while Dad scrubbed bone fragments off his boots. It was a life. Not the normal one, but a life. Some executioners passed down the trade like any other baker's son bakes bread. Butcher's son cuts meat. Executioner's son perfects the guillotine handshake. The paradox. These men upheld justice, but were also morally contaminated. Priests avoided them. Merchants charged extra. People crossed the street to dodge their shadows. Yet without them, the whole system collapsed. No one else wanted the job. And let's be honest, someone had to wield the axe. Justice doesn't carry itself out. It needs hands. Calloused, grimy, damned hands. And the state knew it. That's why some towns paid extra to keep their executioner happy. Good executioners reduced public panic. Clean kills meant fewer riots, so governments bribed them with homes, pigs even marriage prospects. Want to woo a lady? Tell her you're the guy who made a nobleman's head fly 12 feet in a single swing. It's not romantic, but it's honest work. Their tools became infamous. Some executioners named their axes, decorated them, sharpened them with love and dread. These weren't weapons, they were characters. The axe had its own story, its own legend. Passed down like a cursed heirloom. This one took down 40 thieves and a bishop. Imagine putting that on your mantle, and yet many died alone, reviled. Some were buried outside consecrated ground next to prostitutes and plague victims, because no matter how many heads they removed, society never fully welcomed them back in. They were useful monsters, necessary evils, and everyone prayed they'd never see them up close. Sometimes, though, they did. And the executioner looked them in the eye, raised the axe and whispered, "I'll make it quick." That was the final mercy, the last kindness. In a world where death was a public holiday, The best gift a man could give was silence in under 10 seconds. So next time you grumble about your job, emails, meetings, spreadsheets, just be glad it doesn't involve holding a screaming teenager down while you brand the word thief into his forehead. Be glad your workplace doesn't have blood gutters and a cheering section. And be really, really glad that you don't wake up wondering, whose spine do I have to snap today? Because in medieval times, execution wasn't just a punishment. It was a profession. And if you were really, really good at it, you got paid in coin silence and a long walk home where no one said hello. You think IKEA instructions are torture? Try being strapped into a spiked coffin while a guy in a hood reads the medieval version of an assembly guide written in blood. Because when it came to torture, the Middle Ages weren't just creative, they were overachievers. They didn't just want to hurt you, they wanted to invent new ways to ruin your day, your week, and every organ you had inside you. This wasn't justice, it was sadism with a manual and a choir. The medieval toolkit of agony was less about extracting truth, and more about extracting teeth, dignity, and bone fragments. Truth was optional. Screaming was mandatory. And forget subtlety, these devices weren't designed to scare you. They were designed to unmake you while a room full of deeply disturbed men in robes took notes and called it due process. Let's start with the rack, the poster child of medieval hospitality. You were laid flat on a wooden frame, wrists and ankles tied to rollers. Slowly, so slowly they'd crank each end, pulling your body in opposite directions. Muscles tore, joints popped, ligaments snapped like cheap twine. By the time they were done, you were taller, louder, and very much in no shape to disagree with anything. If you confessed, great. If not, they just kept going. Because you know what the truth really needs, a dislocated spine. Then we have the thumb screws, which sound harmless, until you realise they turn your fingers into jelly-filled nightmares. These were small, portable, and perfect for adding just the right amount of agony during a casual conversation about heresy. They'd clamp your thumbs or any other delicate part and twist. You'd hear bones crack, feel flesh compress, and maybe lose a digit or two. It was the medieval version of, are you sure you don't want to talk, but with blood? Still too gentle. Let me introduce you to the Iron Maiden, the prom queen of medieval torture mythology. Contrary to what many believe, this wasn't used frequently, but when it was, it made an impression. Imagine a human-shaped coffin, lined with interior spikes precisely placed to avoid instant death. They'd shut the door slowly, lovingly, so each spike slid into flesh like a handshake from hell. You didn't die quickly. You bled, crushed, suffocated, and screamed until someone forgot to feed you. But maybe you're more of a burn from the inside type. That's where the brazen bull comes in. A hollow metal statue shaped like a bull with a hatch in its side. You're shoved inside the door, sealed, and a fire lit underneath. You roast slowly like a rotisserie chicken of regret. The best part. The bull had sound tubes designed to turn your screams into bull-like groans for audience enjoyment. Because if you're going to cook someone alive, you might as well add audio effects. Let's not forget the strappado. You're tied by the wrist behind your back, hoisted high into the air, and then dropped, suddenly yanking your shoulders out their sockets. If you're lucky, they only do it once. If you're not, they'll repeat it until your arms resemble medieval spaghetti. No blood, no mess, just pure joint destruction. Elegant, efficient, horrifying. Still not impressed. Welcome to the Judas cradle. Picture this, a wooden pyramid with a sharp point at the top. Now picture yourself slowly lowered onto it naked so that the point goes exactly where you think it does. Gravity does the rest. There's no screaming like that screaming. And they'd leave you there for hours, sometimes days, until infection, humiliation, or mercy won, usually not mercy. And then we have the pear of anguish, a device that proves someone somewhere in history had way too much time and zero empathy. This metal fruit was inserted into a mouth rectum or, yes, vagina, depending on your crime. Then it was expanded by turning a screw blooming open like a metal flower of doom. It didn't kill you. It just wrecked whatever dignity or internal organs you still had. They called it persuasion. You called it the reason screaming was invented. Torture wasn't just for confessions. Sometimes it was just for fun, to send a message, to make an example, or to please a noble with nothing better to do on a cloudy Thursday. You didn't need to be guilty, you just needed to be available. And if your torturer was bored or drunk or both, you might end up inventing a new method on the spot. Some torture devices were deceptively simple, like the chair of nails. You sit on it naked, of course, and every movement drives iron spikes deeper into your flesh. You're tied down, so twitching is guaranteed. Screaming is expected. Infection is free of charge. If they were feeling creative, they'd heat the chair from underneath. And congratulations, you're now part of a very painful barbecue. There was also the heretic's fork, which sounds like a cursed salad utensil, but was actually a metal rod with prongs on both ends, one pressed under your chin, the other into your chest. It kept your head upright and immobile. If you moved, it stabbed you. If you fell asleep, it stabbed you. If you tried to pray, stabbed. Welcome to theological torture, where your faith was tested by the angle of your neck. And for the multitaskers in the room, medieval torture had the breaking wheel, which really should have been named the blender for bones. You were tied down. Then someone took a heavy iron wheel and smashed your limbs one at a time. They'd weave your pulverized arms and legs through the wheel spokes like meat ribbons on a bicycle. You'd be hoisted up for public viewing, not dead, just broken, left to rot while crows pick the rest. Even animals weren't spared. Pigs were tortured for killing babies. Cats were burned as symbols of witchcraft. Some interrogations involved beating livestock just to make a point. Pain was democratic in medieval times. Everyone got a taste. Why all this? Why go to such extremes? Simple fear worked. Torture wasn't just about the victim. It was about the audience. Word spread. Fast. You hear about a guy whose jaw was shattered by the boot, and suddenly you're double knotting your shoelaces and paying your taxes early. Fear is a fantastic motivator when wielded with iron tools and no conscience. There was no Geneva Convention, no human rights court. If someone with power wanted answers or revenge, you got tied down and experimented on. Your screams were the soundtrack of law. Your broken bones were the record keepers. Pain was the only courtroom transcript. Some places even had torture specialists. Not just executioners, but trained torturers who knew how to maximize agony without killing. They kept victims alive for days, weeks. Nurses of pain, architects of suffering. Their knowledge was passed down like cooking recipes, except instead of stew, it was how to boil a heretic without breaking the skin. Even the tools themselves told stories. Blood stains that never came out, teeth marks on wooden frames, screws worn down from too many twists. Some torturers grew attached to their instruments, gave them names. Old Bessie, the Whisperer, the Little Persuader. These weren't objects. They were companions in cruelty. And yes, people watched. Sometimes in secret. Sometimes openly. Nobles, clergy, even children peeking through cracks in doors. Torture was a lesson, a ritual. A warning whispered in whimpers. The victim wasn't just a person. They were a canvas, a sacrifice. Proof that disobedience had flavour and it was coppery red. The worst part. It didn't always get results. People confessed to anything under torture. Yes, I killed the bishop, and the baker, and God himself. False confessions piled up like corpses. But that didn't matter. The system didn't want truth. It wanted silence, compliance, and someone to bleed for the sins of the weak. So next time your Wi-Fi drops and you say this is torture, remember the iron chair. Remember the Judas cradle. Remember that somewhere someone confessed to witchcraft just because their thumbs got pulverized into paste. And then thank whatever deity you want that your worst interrogation involves a long phone call with customer service, not a hot poker in your nostril. Because in the Middle Ages, justice didn't knock. It kicked down the door, tied you to a bench and said, "Let's talk about honesty, scream by scream." If you were a woman in medieval Europe and you owned a cat had a mole or simply didn't die during childbirth, congratulations, you were probably a witch. No, really, that's all it took. Wore black witch. Laughed too loudly witch. Knew how herbs worked. Oh boy, you were definitely doing Satan's skincare routine. And once someone pointed their shaky, filthy finger at you, game over. Because the witch trials weren't just a legal process. They were a social panic turned bonfire. The idea of witches had been brewing for centuries, but in the late Middle Ages things escalated from "she's weird" to burn her and take her goats. Why a mix of church hysteria, crop failures, and too many old men with power and boredom? When bad things happened, plague storms, men's egos, the explanation wasn't science. It was Margaret down the road must have slept with a demon again. Because blaming women for everything, now that's a tradition with legs. And don't expect logic. Witch accusations were the opposite of evidence-based reasoning. If you cried during your trial, it meant guilt. If you didn't cry, it meant you were cold-hearted and you guessed it guilty. If you floated during the water test, guilty. If you sank, innocent, but also drowned. Basically, you had a better shot surviving medieval leprosy than escaping a witch accusation. One of the classics was the swimming test, or as I like to call it, wet and dead. The accused would be tied up and thrown into a body of water. The belief holy water would reject evil, so if you floated, you were clearly in league with Satan. If you sank, you were innocent. Yay. Also, yay, you drowned. Either way, your reputation was soggy and your lungs were full. Let's not forget the pricking test. This involved poking the accused with needles or knives to find the devil's mark, a spot that didn't bleed or feel pain. It was science if your definition of science is blood-based nonsense with a side of stabbing. Witch hunters even had retractable fake needles to prove the mark didn't bleed. You heard that right. They literally carried trick tools to rig the outcome. Medieval magic shows were just slightly more stabby. And then came the confessions, almost always under torture. Imagine being sleep-deprived, burned, stretched on the rack and having your fingers crushed, and then someone asks, "Did you dance with demons at midnight?" Of course you say yes. You'd confess to kissing a goat named Gary if it meant they'd stop pulling out your toenails. These weren't trials. These were cruel theatre, and the actors never survived opening night. Women were the majority of victims, especially older women. Widows, midwives, herbalists. Anyone who lived alone knew how to treat a fever or had a sharp tongue. Men feared what they couldn't control, and powerful women by medieval standards were basically dark wizards in aprons. If you knew how to make tea that cured headaches, someone somewhere figured you also knew how to hex a bishop. And the irony, half of these so-called witches were actually keeping people alive. They delivered babies, treated wounds, knew when a plant healed and when it killed. But in a world where medicine involved leeches and prayers, actual knowledge was terrifying. So instead of learning from these women, the system strapped them to stakes and lit the match. Once the accusation started, it was contagious. If you defended a witch, you were probably one too. If you stayed silent, suspicious. If your crops did well while everyone else's failed, witch. If your crops failed too, must be your punishment for secret witchcraft. There was no winning. Just escalating hysteria wrapped in religious seasoning. Speaking of religion, the church was the VIP sponsor of these murder festivals. The Inquisition gave witch hunts its theological backbone, declaring that Satan had a horde of human allies, bent on destroying Christendom through weather manipulation, livestock sabotage, and gasp premarital sex. It was a holy war against women's independence, and if they got a confession, great. If not, torture harder until they screamed the word devil between sobs. Execution was usually by fire. Burning at the stake was both punishment and purification. Fire, they believed, cleansed the soul. So when Margaret the midwife burned alive in front of 300 villagers, everyone clapped politely, wiped away tears, and went home feeling spiritually refreshed. Like church, but with screaming and charcoal. If the fire was slow, even better. That was extra penance. Men were accused too, but much less often, and usually only if they were inconvenient political enemies or husbands of accused women. Which tells you everything you need to know. This wasn't about stopping evil. It was about enforcing silence. Witch trials weren't just executions, they were mass unfriendings medieval style. The worst part, the accused often had no idea what they'd done wrong. You turned my milk sour, you looked at my cow funny, you smiled during the full moon. These were actual complaints. If you had a birthmark witch, if you cried at a funeral witch, if you didn't cry heartless witch, if you were just a normal woman trying to survive a lice-infested century, still a witch. There was no exit. Once the confession came, it was published. Printed pamphlets would list the crimes. She flew on a broomstick, killed 3 hens with a glance, and danced naked in the forest with Satan. None of it real, all of it dramatic. It sold well. People loved reading witch confessionals. Think of it as the medieval tabloid, except the celebrities didn't survive the headline. The psychological horror was worse. Imagine being told every bad thing in the village is your fault. Every child's cough, every failed harvest, every cold morning. You're not just unpopular, you're a cursed scapegoat with a target painted on your soul. And the only way out was death. That was the true burn. Long before the flames. And what about legal defence? There wasn't any. You didn't get a lawyer, you got shackles and maybe some dry bread. Your judge was usually a priest, your jury was a mob, and the final decision came down to who screamed first, you or the fire. In Germany alone, between 50,000 and 80,000 people were executed as witches. That's not justice. That's gendered genocide with a candlelit vibe. Entire communities wiped out. Villages with no grandmothers. Towns that burned so many women the local forest thinned from firewood demand. And all because fear is profitable and female power is threatening. Oh, and don't think this ended with the medieval period. Witch hunts continued into the Renaissance, the Enlightenment. Even today in some parts of the world, women are still being killed over accusations of witchcraft. The bonfires might have gone out, but the stupid, sticky residue of fear and misogyny still lingers in the smoke. You want to talk about dark humour. Consider this, the same men who sentenced witches to death would then go home and ask their wives for soup. The same priest who burned women alive for tempting men spent the rest of the day preaching about forgiveness. The hypocrisy wasn't just thick, it was bubbling over in a cauldron of flaming idiocy. The worst part, it worked. Witch trials silenced women, scared them, shrank their presence, turned independence into suspicion, and wisdom into a death sentence. And it taught entire generations that a woman's power was something to fear, fight and extinguish, with fire if necessary. So the next time someone says witches weren't real, correct them, the witches were real. They were women. The magic was knowledge, survival, strength, and the real monsters wore robes and carried torches. Ah yes, medieval law and its famous motto, thou shalt not steal or else. And by or else we mean, or else we chop off your hand, your ear, maybe a toe if we're feeling generous. If you thought getting caught shoplifting today was embarrassing, try walking home from the village square with a missing limb and a lifetime subscription to public shame. In medieval Europe, stealing wasn't just illegal, it was a surgical experience without anaesthetic. Let's say you're starving, you haven't eaten in 2 days. You spot a warm loaf of bread sitting unattended outside the baker's stall. Your stomach growls, your conscience whispers, and suddenly, bam! A town constable grabs you by the collar and your fate is sealed. Doesn't matter if you're 8 years old or 80. Stealing bread was a capital offence in the court of extreme overreaction. Punishments varied, but all of them had one thing in common: permanence. You didn't get community service, you got partially disassembled. First offence branding or public flogging. Second offence lose a hand. Third offence execution. Because clearly someone who steals 2 loaves of bread is just 3 bites away from full-blown criminal mastermind. Can't have that. Branding was a common punishment. They'd heat a piece of iron shaped like a letter, usually T for thief, and press it onto your skin. Face, hand, or even forehead. Yes, they literally stamped you like expired meat. From that moment on, everyone you met would know this person is a criminal forever. There was no parole, no second chance, just a scar that screamed your past every time you reach for anything. And if they decided to go the hands-off route, literally, they'd take your hand. Usually the right one. The logic was simple: no hand, no theft. It didn't matter why you stole. Hunger, desperation, survival, none of that factored in. Mercy was not on the menu. Only dismemberment. Sometimes performed with an axe, sometimes with a sword, and sometimes with the town watching and the local priest nodding like it was all perfectly normal. Children weren't spared. There are documented cases of kids as young as 7 losing fingers, being branded or even hanged for petty theft. The idea was to set an example. You steal, you suffer, and you're suffering. It was content for the town's daily entertainment. Who needs theatre when you can watch a child bleed in front of the bakery? If you were really unlucky, they'd combine punishments. Start with a branding, then move on to hand removal, then parade you through the streets with your stump wrapped in filthy cloth and a sign around your neck that read "Thief." It wasn't about rehabilitation. It was about humiliation as policy. The justice system wasn't designed to reform, it was designed to maim and make it public. Some towns had dedicated punishment platforms, wooden stages built just for floggings, amputations and hangings. You could literally schedule your morning wake-up feed. The chickens watch a guy lose a hand, then grab lunch at the market. It was so regular people got bored when no one was punished. What no thief today? Guess we'll just go back to our plague-ridden farms in silence. And don't assume nobles were above all this. No, they usually avoided the punishment, but when they were caught, say, robbing other nobles, it became a diplomatic nightmare. Usually they just paid a fine or exiled someone beneath them to take the fall. Medieval justice didn't climb uphill. It rolled downhill like a spiked log, smashing peasants, while the lords toasted to fairness. There were alternatives, sure, like the pillory where you'd be locked in a wooden frame, head and hands exposed left for public mockery. But even that came with risk. People threw rocks, spoiled food, and worse. If someone really hated you, they'd wait until dark and exact their own version of justice, which usually involved sharp things and a total lack of supervision. Let's say you stole a chicken instead of bread. Guess what? Same deal. Theft was theft. One guy stole a pig and was sentenced to be dragged through the town behind the pig until he either repented or lost consciousness. He did both. Another woman stole eggs and had her ears nailed to the pillory, forced to tear them free if she wanted to leave. Yes, self-removal was part of the punishment. Welcome to DIY justice. There were even regional punishments, like having your nose slit, or your lip branded, or your scalp shaved so everyone could see your shame from a mile away. Medieval justice was customizable like a torture buffet. You didn't just get punished, you got tailored suffering measured to your crime and your class. Repeat offenders had it worse. If you were caught stealing more than once, the punishment escalated like a bad video game. Lose a finger first time, hand next time, maybe an eye after that. By the end, you were a walking warning sign, stumbling through life with half your parts and none of your dignity. But hey, at least you weren't hungry, right? The idea was that visible punishment would deter others. See that guy with no hands? Don't be him. But it didn't really work. People kept stealing because hunger doesn't care about consequences. So the system just kept punishing harder and louder, confusing cruelty with efficiency. And just to spice things up, some towns used public whipping posts where you'd be tied and flogged for all to see. If the crime was theft, they might tie the stolen object around your neck. Imagine being beaten while wearing a loaf of bread like a noose. The symbolism was clear. You took what wasn't yours, so now we take everything. In some areas, they let the victim of the theft decide the punishment. This led to wildly inconsistent sentences depending on how grumpy the farmer was that day. One man got branded for stealing turnips. Another got hanged for taking cheese. Justice by mood swing. And if the victim was rich or you were done for, wealth added weight to your guilt. Worse still, animals that stole animals could be punished too. If your dog stole food, it might be killed. If your goat broke into someone's garden, it might be put on trial. and if it was a repeat offender, executed, publicly, sometimes dressed in human clothes because medieval people were somehow both horrifying and weirdly theatrical. Even accidental theft wasn't spared. Pick up the wrong basket at the market that's intent to steal. Borrow something without asking. That's property violation. Didn't return your lord's shovel in time. That's a flogging and a public apology carved into a wooden plank. The line between theft and misunderstanding was drawn in blood, and it shifted constantly. And all this because someone wanted to eat, or stay warm, or live one more day. Medieval punishment wasn't about justice. It was about order through terror, keeping the poor in line, teaching the hungry to stay quiet, and making sure everyone knew your body is collateral. But here's the kicker, stealing from the rich wasn't always punished. Sometimes it was glorified, especially if you were a noble stealing from another noble. That became a feud, a scandal, something to gossip about over ale. But a peasant who took an onion from the lord's cart, that was treason. The scale wasn't about the crime, it was about the class. And don't think this was rare. Records show tens of thousands of amputations, floggings, brandings carried out across medieval Europe. And how many of those thieves were just desperate people trying to survive, most of them. But desperation wasn't a defense. It was just another reason to punish harder. So next time you complain about a $200 fine or a shoplifting citation, remember you still have both hands. You don't have a letter burned into your cheek. You're not tied to a wooden post with cabbage being thrown at your face while a monk mutters something about eternal damnation. Because in the medieval world, stealing bread didn't make you a criminal. It made you a lesson, a symbol, and eventually an amputee with a really dramatic backstory. If you've ever been drunk in public, shouted something rude during church, or had the audacity to exist slightly outside social norms, congratulations, you would have been strapped into a medieval wooden torture bench in front of your entire village. Meet the stocks, the ultimate combo of public humiliation, joint discomfort and community entertainment. Forget jail. Forget fines. The Middle Ages had a better idea. Stick your head and hands through a piece of splintery timber and let every angry villager throw cabbages at your face. Reform by humiliation, they called it, and it worked about as well as you'd expect. The stocks weren't designed to break your body. They were designed to break your reputation, which in a tiny mud-covered hamlet was basically your whole personality. Once people saw your cheeks squished between planks like a misbehaving ham, your social life was over. You didn't bounce back from that. You were that guy. The one who farted during Sunday Mass or insulted the Reeves donkey, and for that you sat in bird poop and shame for 6 hours while children mocked your posture. But don't be fooled by the simplicity of the setup. Stocks were cruel in slow motion. They looked harmless, just wood and a locking mechanism. But after an hour, your legs went numb. Your back screamed. Your neck felt like it had made terrible life choices. 3 hours in, and your dignity had packed up and left town. By the end of the day, you weren't thinking about the insult you made. You were wondering if you'd ever feel your toes again. And the punishment didn't stop with discomfort. Oh no. The real fun came from the audience. Townspeople were encouraged, expected even to pelt you with garbage. Rotting vegetables, rocks, mud animal waste. Anything not nailed down. Sometimes it was nailed down and they threw it anyway. Medieval Yelp reviews came in the form of cabbages to the face. Some towns even had designated shaming hours, usually mid-morning or just after Mass when villagers were most caffeinated with sanctimony. You'd be marched into place, locked in and left there while everyone on their way to the bakery got a free shot at your forehead. It was part punishment, part community bonding. Good morning, Agnes. Did you see Harold in the stocks again? I did. I gave him my worst onion. Felt divine. So what got you into the stocks? Let's make a short list. Being drunk, swearing, gossiping, laziness, bad singing, petty theft, public nudity, saying anything even mildly irreverent about the church or king. Basically, if you had too much personality, you were a candidate. The The stocks were medieval society's way of saying stop being weird. Now you might be thinking, okay, but at least it wasn't torture. Wrong. It was psychological torture wrapped in splinters. You weren't just stuck there for a few hours, you were watched, judged, mocked. And once you were released, you weren't free. You were marked. People remembered. The butcher wouldn't serve you the good meat. The innkeeper gave you the bad ale. Your social credit score 0. Your marriage prospects also 0, unless your soulmate had a thing for public humiliation. Oh, and you could be locked in for days. Some poor souls were left overnight shivering in rain and rats. No blanket, no food. Just shame, cold feet, and the occasional drunk wandering by to relieve himself nearby. 'Cause why not you were part of the furniture now? Just another fixture in the town square like the gallows or the guy who swore he saw a dragon once. In some regions there were variations. The pillory, for example, held you upright head and hands locked in place. It looked more dramatic, so it was reserved for higher profile crimes like fraud or slandering nobility. And if the mob was angry enough, they didn't just throw things, they mobbed. Pulled your hair, spat in your mouth, broke your nose with a boot. 'Cause nothing says justice like a boot print on your cheekbone. Women got it even worse. If you were a scold, i.e. had opinions, you might be placed in the stocks with a sign that read nag. If you gossiped, you might be gagged with an iron bridle, a literal metal muzzle clamped over your tongue. The stocks weren't gender neutral. They were tailored shame suits, custom fitted for society's favourite targets, women, poor people, and anyone who didn't bow fast enough. And let's not forget about the shaming accessories. The signboard, the dunce cap, the fake donkey ears, the bells tied to your wrists so everyone could hear your regret jingling down the lane. Medieval justice was full of these little touches because torture without flair is just lazy cruelty. Some towns even let you pay to upgrade your experience. A small bribe to the constable might mean you only got 3 hours instead of 6. Or you were placed on the shady side of the square. Or they forgot to announce your crime out loud. Welcome to the justice economy, shame-sold by the hour, dignity not included. But the real genius of the stocks, they turned justice into a group project. It wasn't just about punishing the offender, it was about letting everyone participate. Everyone got to feel morally superior, everyone got to hurl a tomato and say, "See, I'm not the worst." It was therapy for the mob and hell for the guy who accidentally urinated near the church fence. And that's the terrifying brilliance of it. The stocks worked. Not because they were brutal, but because they were public. The punishment never left the square. It followed you to the tavern, the harvest fair, the confessional booth. People whispered, smirked, introduced you with a chuckle. That's Geoffrey. He mooned the bishop and got egged for it. Forever remembered for a 6-second mistake. Now imagine the scene. Rain pouring, mud everywhere. You stiff and sore face red with shame dripping in rotten turnip juice. A child walks by and sticks out their tongue. A dog pees on your foot. A rat chews your bootlace. And the village priest passes by and says, "Repent." You nod because what else is there to do when you've become the town's living meme? Occasionally someone died in the stocks. Heat stroke, hypothermia, mob violence. One man was pelted with stones until he choked on his own blood. No one was punished. After all, he was already being punished. So what's a little extra suffering? The system didn't care if it killed you. It just cared that someone learned a lesson, even if that lesson was, don't get caught farting too loud near the Lord's horse. And once your sentence was done, you were released limping, humiliated, emotionally wrecked. Maybe you got to clean up, maybe not. You went home to a house full of silence and judgment. Friends crossed the street. Even your dog looked at you different. You were no longer just a villager. You were a spectacle that had ended. A story everyone knew. A punchline in human form. And yes, people watched like it was reality TV. Stocks o'clock, they'd say. Let's see who's crying today. Children laughed. Adults gossiped. Grandmothers clutched their rosaries and muttered prayers they didn't mean. And somewhere in the back, the local bailiff grinned and said justice served. All because you had a few too many ales and said the bishop's nose looked like a turnip. So no, the stocks didn't draw blood usually. They didn't burn or break bones, but they destroyed people all the same, quietly, slowly, with ridicule instead of iron, with a crowd instead of a whip. Because sometimes the sharpest blade isn't steel, it's the cold stare of your entire community watching you squirm in silence. Next time you make a typo in a group chat or post a dumb tweet, be grateful. No one's locking your face between wooden beams while Barbara from down the lane throws a duck egg at your eyebrow. That's progress. Glorious, unsmelly, emotionally scarring progress. If you thought medieval justice was strange when it came to people, wait until you hear what they did to pigs, or cows, or rats, or on one famously deranged occasion a swarm of locusts. Yes, there was a time when animals were put on trial, assigned defence attorneys sentenced in courtrooms, and in many cases executed with full legal ceremony. Because why punish only humans when you can extend your judicial lunacy to the entire animal kingdom? This isn't satire. This isn't metaphor. These were real documented animal trials, complete with judges, bailiffs, legal fees, and occasionally public hangings. The Middle Ages didn't discriminate. Whether you were a peasant who stole a turnip or a pig who trampled a child, you were considered a moral agent subject to the law. Forget innocent until proven guilty, you were bacon until proven divine. Let's begin with the pigs, the frequent flyers of medieval courtrooms. Pigs were the scapegoat literally and legally. These were free-roaming village-dwelling beasts that often mingled with humans in narrow streets, muddy alleys, and sometimes even homes. Naturally, accidents happened. A pig might bite a child, knock over a cart, or in several horrifying cases maul an infant. The response: try the pig for murder. And not just try it, arrest it. Shackles and all. There are records from 1386 in Falaise, France, where a pig was arrested for killing a baby. The pig was imprisoned, tried in court, sentenced to death, and publicly hanged wearing human clothes. Let that sink in. Somewhere in France there was a pig dangling from a noose in a tiny pair of pants, while villagers watched and nodded solemnly like this was totally reasonable behaviour. You might be thinking, but animals can't understand human law, that's adorable. Medieval logic had a better idea. Animals are part of God's creation, and God's creation is bound by divine law. If humans must follow it, so must pigs, and if they break it, punishment. It was Old Testament meets barnyard drama. And on the seventh day the Lord created rope, and it was used to hang a goose for blasphemy. Some animals even got defence lawyers. That's right. Bar-certified or close enough human beings stood in courtrooms and defended pigs, cows, goats, dogs, donkeys, arguing that the accused was either provoked mentally unfit or simply mistaken for another more guilty animal. In one case, a pig's lawyer argued that the sow had not acted alone and demanded that the entire herd be investigated. That's how you know the Middle Ages were off-the-rails group criminal pig conspiracies, and it wasn't limited to farm animals. In 1519, French authorities brought charges against a group of field rats for eating crops, but rats being rats didn't show up to court. The judge sent a summons. When the rats failed to appear again, he issued a second summons. When that failed, the defence argued that the rats could not safely travel due to the presence of predatory cats en route. I'm not making this up. Someone argued rodent transportation safety in a courtroom and won a delay. It gets better. Some animal trials were held in ecclesiastical courts, especially when the crime was religious in nature, like disturbing a church service, destroying holy relics, or just being a suspicious-looking goat on holy ground. And if the church found you guilty, you could be excommunicated. Imagine being a beetle and getting spiritually banned from heaven. Thou shalt not pass, says the bishop to the insect. And just to round out the lunacy, entire species were sometimes put on trial. If locusts devoured crops, the church might issue a collective curse or excommunication against the whole swarm. Picture a courtroom where a priest shouts Latin at a cloud of bugs hoping they'll hear and repent. Medieval pest control, but make it theological. Begone foul creatures, or we'll send you to hell, a place notably worse than this turnip field. Some punishments were absurdly elaborate. A pig might be dressed in human clothes, placed on trial in front of a jury, and if found guilty, hanged, burned, or buried at crossroads. The symbolism mattered. The trial wasn't just justice. It was ceremony drama, a grim morality play starring livestock. People attended like it was theatre, because frankly it was. Tragic, funny, insane, and in some twisted way entertainment. You might ask, why go through all this? Why not just kill the animal and move on? Because medieval justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about order, symbolism, and absolving human guilt. If a child died, someone had to pay. If a harvest failed, someone had to be blamed. And if no human fit the bill, then by God the goat will hang. Animals were also punished to prevent superstition from spiralling. If the town believed the devil had possessed a pig, and the authorities did nothing, the fear would fester. Disease, witchcraft, demonic influence. The animal trial was the church and state stepping in and saying, relax. We've handled it. Satan has been evicted from the cow. A dead cow was worth 1,000 sermons. And let's not forget public fear. Pigs weren't pets, they were unpredictable, filthy, and capable of serious injury. If left unpunished, one attack might cause a panic. Suddenly, every oinking creature is the devil's agent. Trials weren't just for justice. They were reassurance by rope. The town saw a pig punished and breathed easier, until the next one wandered into the wrong street. In some rare cases, the animals were acquitted. A dog that accidentally killed its owner during a hunting trip. A cat accused of stealing bread. When acquitted, the animal might be returned to its owner if it hadn't already been sold, eaten, or renamed Lucky. But the fact that there were records of acquittals tells you how seriously they took this. Justice wasn't blind. It was just really confused. Of course, not all animal crimes were violent. Some were just weird. Like the rooster in Basel accused of laying an egg. Why was this a crime? Because rooster eggs were considered ingredients in witchcraft. The rooster, now a poultry warlock, was burned at the stake for consorting with the dark arts. Somewhere in heaven, that chicken is still clucking in disbelief. And yes, cats were targeted too, especially black cats. Associated with witches, they were often tortured, burned, or drowned alongside their human masters. If a woman was suspected of witchcraft, the cat didn't stand a chance. Guilty by association, guilty by fur colour, guilty by existing with too much independence. Feeling freedom was dangerous. The practice of animal trials didn't vanish overnight. They lingered into the 18th century in rural areas, and their legacy, a deep, weird scar in legal history. The idea that everything must fit inside a human box of blame, punishment, and spectacle. Even animals, even insects, even a bear accused of theft in Russia. That one was acquitted, by the way, probably had a great lawyer. So next time your dog chews your shoe or your cat knocks over a glass, thank modernity. In the 1400s, that glass might have been a chalice, that shoe a holy relic, and your pet on trial for desecration, and possibly the Antichrist. Because in the Middle Ages, even man's best friend was one step away from public execution. The animal trials weren't justice, they were projection. Grief, fear, anger channeled into creatures who couldn't speak, couldn't argue, couldn't understand why the humans were suddenly so angry. It wasn't about the pig, it was about us. Our marriage in the Middle Ages, a sacred bond, a social contract, and more often than not, a slow-motion crime scene wrapped in lace and livestock. This wasn't love. This was land deals, power grabs, and alliances sealed with a kiss and a goat. Romance was optional. Obedience was mandatory. And if you broke your vows, especially as a woman, the punishment was swift, public, and soaked in shame. Let's talk adultery, the ultimate crime of the heart, and more dangerously of the head. Because if your spouse cheated in medieval Europe, the result wasn't couples therapy. It was flogging, exile, branding, head shaving, or in some delightful corners of the continent, stoning in the town square, and not the chill kind of stoning. the actual rocks in your face until you die kind. But like everything else in medieval justice, the punishment depended on who you were. A nobleman caught in adultery likely forgiven, maybe fined, maybe sent to a monastery for a weekend retreat. A noblewoman caught yikes. She could be locked in a tower, forced to wear a donkey's tail in public or have her nose cut off. Because clearly the logical response to cheating is facial mutilation. Nothing says marital repair, like a permanent disfigurement and a strong breeze where your nose used to be. For peasants, it was often more theatrical. A cheating wife might be dragged through the village in a cart hair shorn, wearing nothing but a shift and a sign that read adulteress. The husband might get away with a fine or a shrug, because medieval gender equality was less 50-50 and more burn her and give him a beer. Double standards weren't just social, they were legally enforced with ropes and firewood. And don't forget the church's role. These weren't just civil matters, they were spiritual infractions, and the church was delighted to step in. Adulterers were excommunicated, denied communion, and forced to do penance, often barefoot in public wearing sackcloth while begging forgiveness from everyone from the bishop to the village goat. Some had to crawl on hands and knees to the altar. One woman was forced to lick the floor of the cathedral every Sunday for a year. Divine Grace Medieval Edition. Men could be punished too, especially if they got caught sleeping with someone else's wife. In some towns, the sentence was castration, but only if the husband had enough influence to make it happen. More often, the guilty man was flogged in the square while being pelted with rotten fruit and worse. Occasionally the crowd got creative, tying fake horns to his head and parading him around as the bull. Because why just beat someone when you can also humiliate them with dairy-themed cosplay? But the woman always worse. If you were caught, it wasn't just about sin. It was about property damage. Wives were considered the legal possessions of their husbands. So cheating wasn't breaking trust. It was trespassing on someone else's goods. You weren't a person. You were a wine barrel with opinions. And if you dared roll into the wrong cellar, you got branded as spoiled. Some towns had cucking stools, also called scold's bridles or ducking chairs. These weren't just for gossipers, they were for women accused of infidelity. You'd be tied to the chair and dunked repeatedly in a freezing river while the village watched and judged. Too loud, duck her. Too proud, duck her. Slept with the miller's apprentice, duck her till the lice flee. It was punishment with splash damage, part justice, part wet t-shirt contest from hell. And guess what? False accusations were common. If a man wanted to get rid of his wife, all he had to do was whisper about a suspicious meeting or a too friendly neighbour, and the town did the rest. Women were convicted on gossip alone. No proof, no witnesses, just male paranoia dressed up in a cloak and a gavel. Divorce was nearly impossible. The church viewed marriage as unbreakable until death or extreme papal paperwork. So couples stayed together out of fear, shame, or legal trap. Unless you were a noble with land and a cousin in Rome, your marriage was permanent. Affairs were often the only escape valve, and everyone knew it. Cheating was punished harshly not because it was rare, but because it was everywhere. Let's pause and appreciate the medieval marriage dynamic. Your spouse was likely chosen for you. You married young. You shared a bed with someone who smelled like boiled cabbage and spoke in grunts. There was no contraception, no privacy, and no date nights. Just survival childbirth and a mutual agreement not to kill each other before Lent. And when someone inevitably snapped, the town loved it. In one French village, a man accused his wife of cheating and brought her to court with a pair of used bedsheets as evidence. The court ruled the stains inconclusive, but ordered the woman to wear a black veil and sit outside the church every Sunday in silence for 6 months. The man got a fine for wasting the judge's time, because even medieval justice occasionally called out medieval nonsense. But don't let that fool you. In most cases, once accused, you were doomed. The punishment was designed to linger. Branding was common, not just for thieves, but adulterers too. A woman might be marked with an A, or a cross on her shoulder, or forced to wear bells sewn into her dress so everyone could hear her shame before they saw it. Think Hester Prynne, but with more livestock and less symbolism. Some communities got poetic. In parts of Germany, adulterers were forced to walk backwards around the village square wearing a pig's mask and holding a broom between their legs. Why, no one really knows. But it happened. Because if there's one thing the Middle Ages loved, it was mixing moral judgment with livestock-based costumes. And of course, death was always on the table. In cases of high-profile adultery, particularly among nobles or clergy, the accused might be strangled, burned, or buried alive. Queen Caroline of Brunswick faced trial for alleged adultery in 1820. Yes, we're stretching medieval a bit. And although she wasn't executed, the spectacle nearly tore England apart. Because nothing says eternal moral truth like royal hypocrisy and tabloid headlines carved into stone. If you were pregnant from adultery, things got even bloodier. Women were accused of witchcraft or demonic seduction. The child was labelled born of sin and might be abandoned, taken by the church, or worse. One law even required the execution of a woman who birthed a child while married but with no clear father, because apparently being pregnant was evidence enough that your womb had committed treason. Men who suspected infidelity sometimes demanded trial by ordeal. The wife might be forced to hold a red-hot iron or retrieve a stone from boiling water. If her wounds healed cleanly, she was innocent, if not guilty. Either way, she lost. Because medieval justice always put women between fire and patriarchy. Oddly enough, adultery wasn't always private punishment. In many places, it was celebrated when exposed. People gathered to watch the trials. Towns paused work. Children gossiped. It was entertainment soap opera meets sadism, and if the accused broke down crying, bonus points. It meant the shame was sinking in. And just to twist the knife, sometimes the cheating wasn't even real. A man might lie to cover his own affair. A priest might accuse a woman he was obsessed with. A neighbour might spread rumours to get revenge over a bad fence. The truth didn't matter. The accusation itself was enough to destroy a life. So yes, cheating in the Middle Ages was more than scandal. It was a capital offence dressed in emotional lace and public flogging. The body was policed, the soul was judged, and the punishment wasn't just meant to hurt. It was meant to last. Long after the bruises faded, the whispers stayed. Marriage wasn't just sacred. It was a cage, an adultery. That was the match someone lit to burn the whole thing down. Welcome to Church Court, where the robes are longer, the Latin is louder, and the punishments are somehow even more terrifying than your average axe-wielding sheriff. If you thought medieval secular justice was bad, wait until you meet God's legal team, also known as ecclesiastical courts, an unholy mix of theology, bureaucracy, and spectacular overreaction. You didn't need to commit a crime to end up here. You just had to sin loud enough for a monk to notice. Church courts were technically separate from the state, but don't let that fool you. They had just as much power and way less chill. And while civil courts were obsessed with theft and arson, church courts focused on the juicy stuff: blasphemy, adultery, heresy, usury, witchcraft, cursing bad thoughts, and sometimes just looking smug during Mass. If you dared to think for yourself, or worse, read a Bible without permission, you were basically asking to be spiritually slapped into next week. Let's be clear, you didn't even need to do something. You just needed someone to say you might have. One neighbour's whisper, one priest's suspicion, and suddenly you're hauled before a bench of grim-faced men who haven't smiled since 1173. These weren't judges in the modern sense, they were clerics, with robes a grudge and a working knowledge of Latin insults. And unlike civil courts, church trials were not about facts. They were about faith, proof optional, eyewitnesses, meh. What really mattered was whether your soul felt guilty. You could be put on trial for harbouring impure thoughts, which is medieval code for the priest doesn't like your face. And once accused, your odds of escape were somewhere between slim and divine intervention. One of the greatest hits of the church court was the infamous heresy trial. Heresy was the act of having the wrong opinion about God, which conveniently was decided by the same people judging you. You didn't have to preach it. Just saying, maybe the sun doesn't orbit the earth, could land you in a deep theological hole, usually dug with red-hot tongs and confession under duress. And oh, the confessions! These were not friendly interviews. You'd be imprisoned in a stone cell the size of a broom closet, fed once a day maybe, and interrogated repeatedly. If you held firm, they assumed you were possessed. If you broke down, they assumed you were guilty. There was no winning. It was spiritual waterboarding with candlelight and incense. Some heretics got creative. There was a guy who claimed Christ lived in a nearby forest. Another said heaven was shaped like a chicken. The church didn't find this amusing. Heresy wasn't cute. It was a threat to their monopoly on truth, and they treated it like treason. You got excommunicated first like a warning shot, then tortured, then if your answers weren't satisfactory, publicly executed for the glory of theological purity. Execution methods varied. Burning at the stake was the fan-favourite fire, after all being the church's favourite metaphor made literal. But others were strangled, flayed, or starved to death in monasteries. Sometimes they just paraded you through town in a sack labelled heretic before tossing you into a ditch. Mercy was very situational. And don't think this was limited to people with radical ideas. No, the church court went after everyone: widows who didn't remarry fast enough, merchants who lent money at interest to midwives, suspected of unnatural knowledge, bakers who refused to tithe, and basically anyone who sneezed without crossing themselves afterward. In fact, refusing to pay tithes, the church's 10% tax on everything, was practically a sin against God's wallet. You could be sued, excommunicated, and have your property seized. Church bailiffs would show up, confiscate your plough, your pig, even your mattress. You weren't just broke, you were damned and broke, which is the worst combo. Then there was blasphemy, the verbal landmine of medieval life. Say the wrong thing about a saint or relic, or the bishop's weird haircut, and boom, you're on trial. Punishments included public whippings, gag devices, enforced silence, literally a bridle with a metal tongue piece, and long pilgrimages to atone, which is code for walk 800 miles in sandals while people throw pebbles at you. But perhaps the most absurd category of church court punishment was moral correction. That's where things really spiraled into comedy horror territory. Married couples brought in for not showing enough affection. Servants accused of laziness. People penalised for laughing too loud during Easter. One woman was punished for wearing overly bright colours, because apparently joy was suspicious. You might think at least they had lawyers, right? Nope. Most people represented themselves, or more accurately tried not to cry, while priests debated their soul's worth in Latin. In some cases, the accused didn't even know what they were being tried for. They just show up and hear you have offended the church. Discuss. Imagine being forced to debate your salvation like it's open mic night at a monastic debate club, and women absolutely no chance. The church saw women as spiritual liabilities, too emotional, too carnal, too easily led into sin. A woman suspected of heresy had a better chance being reborn as a pinecone than being acquitted. They were often accused of witchcraft seduction or influencing others with feminine speech, whatever that meant. Probably breathing in public. Even priests and monks weren't safe. Church courts investigated them too for things like gluttony, drunkenness, gambling, or secretly liking poetry. Some were punished with forced fasting, public penance, or being reassigned to a plague-infested monastery as humble correction. Because nothing says repentance like sharing a room with 6 dying pilgrims and a rat named Reginald. The church even punished the dead. If someone died under suspicion of heresy, they'd dig up the corpse, put it on trial, and if found guilty, burn the body posthumously. That's not justice. That's grudge-driven pyromania. Imagine being so hated they set your bones on fire just to make a point. Oh, and speaking of burning, books weren't safe either. Possess the wrong manuscript trial. Read a banned gospel trial. Write something with a hint of independent thought, trial, burning ashes. Repeat. The church didn't just police bodies, it policed ideas. And when ideas burned, so did the people who loved them. The Inquisition, of course, was church court on steroids. Launched in the 12th century, it was a travelling tribunal of monks whose job was to sniff out heresy like a bloodhound in a theology library. They had immense power, minimal oversight, and zero patience for nuance. If you confessed, you were tortured. If you didn't confess, you were tortured. If you survived the torture miracle, still guilty. One inquisitor bragged that he could get a confession from any man in less than an hour with fire and prayer. That's not theology. That's a medieval version of enhanced interrogation with holy water and a soundtrack of screaming peasants. And the craziest part, most people went along with it. Because resistance wasn't just dangerous, it was unthinkable. You weren't just defying the church, you were defying God. So yes, church court was its own brand of hell. A place where faith met fear, where sin was a courtroom sentence, and where theology was sharpened into a blade. You didn't need to be guilty, you just needed to be noticed. And once the bells rang and the monks appeared, you knew your soul was about to get scrubbed with fire. Ah, monarchy! That glorious medieval system where one man's hangover could decide whether you lived, died, or lost a limb. If you think justice is blind, then in the Middle Ages it was also drunk, moody, and had a crown on its head. Because when it came to law and order, the king didn't follow the rules, he was the rules. And nothing screamed due process louder than a gold-plated mood swing and a royal decree scribbled between turkey legs. Let's be blunt, the king's justice was personal. If he liked you, he'd pardon you for murder. If you sneezed in his direction or reminded him of his cousin who owed him money, well, good luck keeping your head. You weren't just at the mercy of the law, you were at the mercy of whatever the monarch had for breakfast that morning. Bacon, maybe leniency. Bad wine, execution at noon. Sure, there were laws written down, scrolls, edicts, codes. But those were more like polite suggestions in the presence of absolute power. If the king wanted to override them, he did. If he wanted to invent a new law on the spot, he did that too. Sometimes he'd enforce the law so strictly people couldn't breathe without a permit. Other times he'd ignore every legal document in existence because he got a good feeling about someone's haircut. One day a noble might be rewarded for loyalty with lands and gold. The next day the same noble's head might be on a spike for treason, a word that in medieval, royal vocabulary roughly meant inconvenient person with opinions. The king didn't need proof. He just needed a vibe. And the kingdom obeyed because saying, hey, maybe that's not fair was a great way to get invited to your own funeral. And don't forget the royal prerogative, which was basically legal speak for I do what I want. The king could arrest, pardon, exile, or execute anyone for anything without anyone questioning it. It was law by ego, law by drama, law by, I had a dream last night that Sir Thomas is a werewolf, so now he's a pile of ashes, and the worst part, no appeal. The king's word wasn't final, it was divine. Execution under royal justice was almost an art form. Kings loved spectacle. If you betrayed the crown or were accused of it, you weren't just killed, you were staged. Heads on spikes, guts on display. Sometimes entire towns were invited to watch as a warning. Don't cross me, the king's justice whispered, or your intestines will be audience participation. Royal courts weren't just unpredictable, they were theatrical. The king might invite a crowd to watch him pass judgment, making it a public flex. He'd sit in a fancy chair, stroke his beard dramatically and issue verdicts like a medieval Simon Cowell. You insulted my favourite bishop, hang him, but make it poetic. It wasn't law. It was ego performance in velvet robes. Even the location of justice was wild. The king could hold court literally anywhere, a field, a ship, the Great Hall, or in one particularly insane case, the royal bedroom. Imagine pleading for your life, while the king lounges in bed, half-dressed, sipping wine, and deciding whether you're worth keeping alive based on how annoying your voice sounds. Terrifying. Also very on-brand. Some monarchs were worse than others. King John of England, yes, the Robin Hood one, was so famously vindictive that barons basically forced him to sign the Magna Carta in 1215 just to stop him from ruining everyone's life on a whim. It didn't work. He ignored it. Because what's the point of writing down rules when the king can just chuck them into the moat when he's cranky? And then there was Richard II, who once executed people just for being part of a prophecy that he might be overthrown. Thought crime medieval edition. Or Henry VIII, who made marrying him a full-time death hazard. Didn't bear a male air off with her head. Looked at another man, Tower of London. Sneezed incorrectly. Probably a witch. Marrying a king wasn't romantic. It was playing chess with a man who kept flipping the board and calling it divine will. Let's not forget royal favourites, the cronies and suck-ups who could get away with literal murder because they made the king laugh. These were the real winners of the system, the professional bootlickers. They whispered in the king's ear, flattered his horse, laughed at his jokes and got rewarded with lands, titles and the occasional dead rival. It wasn't justice. It was high-stakes court gossip with knives. Sometimes the king didn't even have to say anything. Just a raised eyebrow could signal death. A sigh could send someone to the dungeon. If you were in royal presence, every word, gesture and blink mattered. Even standing in the wrong place could be interpreted as plotting rebellion. One poor servant tripped on a rug, knocked over a goblet, and was hanged for sacrilege via clumsiness. Tough day at work, and God forbid you were right about something. Correcting the king, even politely, was social suicide. The king wasn't just a ruler. He was God's representative, and God didn't like being contradicted. If the king said the moon was made of cheese, you nodded, agreed, and prayed to Camembert that you wouldn't be next. And while the nobility suffered from this chaotic justice, peasants got the worst of it. You could be fined for letting your pigs wander, flogged for not bowing fast enough, drafted into war because the king got bored on a Tuesday. And if a royal tax collector was murdered in your village, congratulations, your whole town might be burned to the ground as an example. Because nothing says justice like torching 50 innocent farmers for someone else's vendetta. But the king wasn't just about punishment. Oh no. He could also forgive anything, and often did for political reasons, for spectacle, or because someone gave him a particularly nice tapestry. Murder pardoned, treason pardoned, married your cousin without permission, pardoned and congratulated if you brought a dowry. Royal forgiveness was just as random as royal fury, and people knew this. Everyone walked on eggshells. Lords, bishops, even other royals tiptoed around the king's mood like he was a nuclear cannon dressed in fur. He might be your ally one day, your executioner the next. Every court was full of fake smiles, flattery and anxiety disguised as elegance. A bad dinner could shift a law. A good song could save a city. The ultimate irony, kings often claim divine authority. I am chosen by God. My will is sacred. Which meant any criticism of royal justice wasn't just treason, it was blasphemy. Talk back to the king, and you weren't just defying the crown, you were questioning heaven. Which in medieval terms meant start digging your own grave. So was there any consistency? Sometimes. Some kings tried. They created councils, consulted with advisors, even wrote down actual codes of law. But the truth was, as long as the king could wake up and say, actually, I've changed my mind, no law was safe. Justice wasn't a system, it was a feeling with a sceptre. Next time you think your local parking ticket is unfair, just remember at least it wasn't handed to you by a monarch who just had a bad dream about you. At least your speeding fine wasn't accompanied by exile and confiscation of your sheep. At least the judge in your life doesn't own a sword engraved with "because I said so." Because in the Middle Ages, justice didn't wear a blindfold. It wore a crown, carried a grudge, and signed death warrants between sips of mead. If you thought children in the Middle Ages were treated with tenderness, innocence, and bedtime lullabies, oh sweet summer child, think again. The medieval world didn't have youth crime. It had tiny criminals with even tinier consequences for their bones. Children weren't seen as developing minds or adorable little chaos goblins. They were just smaller, clumsier adults who could still be whipped, shackled, fined, or executed. Mercy was not child-sized. The idea of childhood as a protected, innocent stage of life, that didn't exist. A 7-year-old could legally be held responsible for theft, blasphemy, or even heresy. In some towns, you were considered criminally liable at age 5. At 5, modern kids struggle with shoelaces. In the Middle Ages, they struggled with being publicly flogged for stealing a turnip. Punishments weren't softened just because your voice squeaked or your hands were still sticky from apples. They were often just downsized. Instead of full execution, maybe you'd just get half the lashes, or be locked in the children's stocks. Yes, those existed, which were the same as regular stocks, but slightly lower to the ground. Because accessibility matters when you're humiliating minors. And what were the crimes? Oh, everything. Stealing bread, swearing in church, playing dice, skipping work, talking back, lying to adults, looking suspicious, being poor, existing loudly. Pick a behaviour, and somewhere some child in medieval Europe got whipped for it. One boy was punished for climbing a fence too enthusiastically. Another was beaten in the square for dishonest eyes. What does that even mean? No one knows, but the lashes still landed. Whipping was the go-to solution. Children were flogged with sticks, rods, belts, and occasionally thorn branches. In schools, it was practically the curriculum. Today we learn Latin, then we bleed a little. Teachers were legally allowed and often encouraged to beat students for laziness, bad handwriting, or looking confused, and parents. They didn't just allow it. Many paid extra for it. Spare the rod spoil, the child wasn't a warning. It was a public service announcement. Sometimes the punishment escalated. Children were branded, yes, branded with hot irons if they were caught stealing more than once. Others were maimed, fingers chopped off ears, sliced noses disfigured. A boy in 14th century England lost his right hand for stealing a loaf of rye bread. He was 8. The court called it merciful because he wasn't hanged. A child with one hand and a lifetime of trauma, mercy, medieval style. Public shaming was also popular. Kids might be dressed in rags with the word thief stitched across their chest. Others were forced to crawl on their knees through the church crying and confessing their sins while villagers laughed. Some were paraded with donkey ears on their heads, bells on their wrists, or pigtails tied to their backs. Humiliation made cute like a carnival of cruelty. If you were a girl, the rules were worse. Girls were punished not just for crimes, but for immodesty, temptation, and excessive talk. Being too cheerful could land you in hot water. So could dancing, or singing, or existing without adult supervision. One girl was ducked in a pond for wearing bright colours and provoking sinful thoughts in a stable boy. He was 12. She was 10. The patriarchy had a bedtime story and it was a horror novella. And let's talk about work. Medieval kids worked hard. Field labour kitchen, labour apprenticeships, messenger work, you name it. If you failed to perform, you didn't get detention. You got beaten, fired, flogged. In some towns, lazy apprentices were tied to whipping posts for the public to motivate. Motivation, of course, being a synonym for survive the bruises. Apprenticeship was often glorified as education, but it was really indentured servitude with a side of bruised ribs. If you displeased your master, you might be punished on the spot. Some were locked in cellars for days. Others were forced to sleep outside in winter. One boy was shoved into a barrel of flour and rolled down a hill. Medieval HR didn't exist. In royal courts and noble households, page boys and servant children fared only slightly better. They were dressed nicely and beaten politely. Correction, it was called. Some had discipline days built into their schedules. Imagine knowing that every third Wednesday you were guaranteed a spanking just to keep you humble. And then there were the real horror stories executions. Yes, children were executed. It wasn't common, but it wasn't unthinkable either. In 15th century France, a 13-year-old boy was hanged for striking a priest. In England, a 10-year-old was burned for allegedly committing arson. Courts didn't weep. The public didn't protest. They just watched as small feet dangled from gallows and called it justice. The law didn't believe in second chances. A child accused of theft 3 times might be sentenced to branding exile or worse. If they survived, they were often banished to forests where starvation and wolves did what the judge couldn't. Exile was basically death by slow narrative. No bedtime, no food, just cold wind and regret. Even religious punishments found their way to the cradle. Children were excommunicated for heresy, for stealing from monasteries, or for refusing to confess. Some were denied burial in consecrated ground. Others were forced to wear heavy crosses during Mass or sleep in graveyards to reflect on sin. Reflect, they were 6. They barely knew what a sin was, but punishment came first. Comprehension was optional, and don't think church schools were better. Monastic schools were discipline factories where learning happened between beatings. Education through fear was the motto: memorize the Psalms or memorize the feel of birch bark on your spine. Some monks were known for smiling only while hitting children. Others kept punishment logs like trophies. One school reportedly flogged students for dreaming during lessons, actual dreams, sleep crimes. Even infants weren't fully safe. If a baby cried during Mass or a baptism, some priests would interpret it as a sign of early sin. A warning, a curse, something to pray or slap out of them. Baptismal slaps were real. One Italian priest reportedly slapped newborns to drive out Satan through the ears. It was tradition. And Satan, it turns out, was very punctual in medieval nurseries. All of it stemmed from the belief that children were born sinful. Original sin wasn't just theology, it was judicial policy. Kids weren't seen as innocent souls in need of nurturing. They were miniature threats in need of control, and the only tools available were fear, pain, and humiliation. So next time someone says children today are too soft, feel free to remind them at least modern kids aren't being flogged for failing to bow correctly, or branded for stealing half an onion, or paraded through the streets wearing pig ears and holding a sign that says bad. Because in the medieval world, justice didn't stop at the nursery door. It barged in swinging a rod. If you've ever been accused of talking too much, interrupting, complaining, or having too many opinions, congratulations, you'd fit right in as a prime suspect for one of medieval Europe's favourite female-specific punishments, the scold's bridle. Or as I like to call it, the shut-up helmet forged in hell. Because in the Middle Ages, the crime of being a loud woman was taken very seriously. And by seriously, I mean they literally put women in metal muzzles for speaking. Let's start with the terminology. A scold wasn't a witch or a criminal. She wasn't violent. She didn't rob a merchant or curse a bishop. No, her only crime was being annoying to men. Maybe she argued with her husband. Maybe she gossiped. Maybe she shouted at a drunk in the street. In any case, if a woman was too verbal, too assertive, or just refused to stay politely silent in a corner, the punishment came not with a warning, but with an iron gag strapped to her face. This scold's bridle, also called the brank, was a metal cage that fit over a woman's head. Sometimes it was as simple as a strap of iron across the mouth. Other times it was an elaborate cage with a long flat bit that pressed down on the tongue, or hooked painfully inside the mouth. The point wasn't just to muffle her voice, it was to cause constant grinding, humiliating pain every time she tried to speak. These devices were hand-forged with creativity and cruelty. Some had spikes, others had bells attached to the top so villagers could hear the woman coming like a walking warning label with a side of trauma. A few were decorated with twisted mocking designs, devil horns, grotesque faces, or long noses meant to match the woman's personality. Medieval humour was less ha-ha, and more how can we combine misogyny and metallurgy. The sentence for being a scold could come from a husband, a town magistrate, or a parish priest, and the evidence, oh, it was airtight. She talks too much. She shamed her husband. She called her neighbour fat. She expressed thoughts without permission. No witnesses needed, just vibes and volume. The punishment was almost always public, because in medieval logic, if a woman made a scene, she deserved one in return. Once fitted into the bridle, the woman was paraded through town like a criminal mascot. People jeered. Children laughed, men applauded, and the woman. She walked slowly, bleeding from the mouth tears, streaming, unable to cry out without impaling her tongue. It was humiliation theatre, and the audience was everyone with 2 eyes and half a moral compass. And this wasn't a fringe practice. It spanned countries. England, Scotland, parts of Germany and the Netherlands all had documented cases. Some towns even had bridle posts where women could be locked in place, bridled and chained for hours or days. Occasionally the punishment was extended forced silence for a week, or no speaking to men until Easter. Because silence wasn't just golden, it was enforced with iron and sanctioned by clergy. Of course this was gendered. Men were not punished for gossiping. A loud man was passionate. A loud woman was hysterical. A sarcastic man was clever. A sarcastic woman, probably a witch. And if you combined gossip with being poor, unmarried or widowed well, you might as well walk yourself to the blacksmith and ask for a custom fit. The scold's bridle wasn't just a punishment. It was a muzzle for women who dared to exist loudly. Let's take a closer look at the pain. Imagine iron pressing down on your tongue. Every time you try to swallow or breathe, it digs in. Your teeth grind against metal. Your lips split from dryness. Your jaw locks in place. If you shift too much, the bit slices deeper. And if you faint or fall, you still wear the mask until someone decides you've learned your lesson. And what exactly was the lesson? Shut up! That was it. Stop complaining. Stop questioning. Stop mocking your drunk neighbour. Stop asking why your rent went up. Stop talking back to your husband. Stop telling the priest he smells like cheese. Stop reminding the constable that his wife left him. Just stop talking forever if possible. Some bridles had internal spikes ensuring that even thinking about speaking came with blood. Others had engraved insults: nag, witch, scold, devil's tongue. Because apparently nothing says God's justice like tattooing a woman's personality onto her torture device. It wasn't about silence. It was about identity theft, ripping her voice away and replacing it with humiliation on a stick. And yes, there were deaths. Women choked, got infections, bit through their own tongues, collapsed from dehydration or blood loss. Sometimes the punishment turned into a slow, torturous execution, all while the town watched and said, she should have minded her tone. The medieval world had no mercy for the mouthy. Worse, this wasn't always about actual words. Sometimes it was about how the woman said them. Too loud, too fast, too smart, too funny. Yes, funny women were often targets, especially if they made men look foolish. A clever insult could earn you a morning in chains. A well-timed joke might cost you your tongue. Because God forbid a woman win an argument in public. That was practically heresy with punchlines. And it wasn't always about the town. Husbands could request the punishment. If a man felt disrespected, he could bring his wife before the magistrate and say, she nags. And that was enough. No trial, no jury. Just a blacksmith, a piece of iron, and a lesson to be taught. Domestic abuse? No such concept. It was discipline and the law nodded along. Now you might think, surely not every town allowed this. And you'd be half right. Some areas banned the practice and replaced it with ducking stools, whipping posts, or forced silence under threat of banishment. Because if the goal is submission, the method is just a matter of taste. And medieval taste was iron, water, and shame. Even after release, the punishment didn't end. A woman who had worn the bridle was marked. People whispered. Children pointed. Men joked. Women distanced themselves. You didn't just lose your voice, you lost your community. You became a warning, a legend, a punchline that bled. And here's the kicker. This practice survived longer than you'd think. There are reports of scolds' bridles still in use in the 18th century. That's right. While Mozart was composing symphonies, women were still being muzzled in churchyards for complaining about rent. Enlightenment, it seems, had a very selective guest list. The scold's bridle wasn't about law. It was about control, silencing the poor, silencing the angry, silencing the truth-tellers, silencing the clever, silencing any woman who dared to speak in her own voice. And it wasn't just a piece of iron, it was a message clanging through the square. This is what happens when you forget your place. So the next time someone says, "Why are women so loud these days?" remind them we had centuries of silence to make up for. If you've ever stood in front of your closet panicking over what to wear, congratulations, you would have been a suspect in a medieval courtroom. Not because you were indecisive, but because back then clothing wasn't just fashion, it was law. And breaking those laws, that wasn't a minor offence. In many cases, it was a literal death sentence. Welcome to the world of sumptuary laws, the legal system's way of turning your wardrobe into a criminal record. These laws dictated who could wear what, in what colour, made of what fabric, and how many buttons you were allowed to flaunt like a degenerate show-off. Velvet reserved for nobility. Silk, that's for the upper clergy peasant. Fur only if it came from an animal lower on the prestige food chain, like a squirrel, not a fox. You weren't dressing yourself. You were dressing inside a caste system. One mistake, and suddenly your boots meant you were impersonating a lord. An impersonation was treason with a fashion accessory. Let's break it down. The idea behind sumptuary laws was to maintain social order. Translation: make sure the poor stayed visibly poor and the rich looked like they were dipped in gold and smugness. These laws were obsessed with visual hierarchy. You had to look like your status. You couldn't dress above your station. Heaven forbid a farmer's son show up in crimson and confuse the village into thinking he wasn't destined to die of a tooth infection before 30. Colours were especially risky. Purple royalty only, scarlet nobility, deep blue high-ranking clergy, gold thread. Don't even look at it unless you've got a title and a letter from God. In England, wearing purple without the king's permission was considered an act of treason, as in off with your head because your tunic looked too majestic. You didn't just wear colour, you wore compliance. And no, these weren't vague guidelines, they were meticulously detailed. The 1363 English sumptuary law went full fashion police and listed exactly which classes could wear, which materials, cuts, trims and colours. There were rules about sleeve width, hat height, shoe pointiness. One law even regulated the size of feathers in hats because clearly the length of your plume could collapse civilization. Punishment for breaking sumptuary laws ranged from fines to public shaming to actual death. Yes, death for fashion crimes. A tailor caught wearing fur he wasn't entitled to could be whipped or branded. A merchant who dressed like a noble could be put in the stocks with a sign that said imposter, because nothing says justice like public humiliation and a velvet doublet. Women had an even worse surprise. Laws targeted their jewellery, embroidery, shoe materials, even their undergarments. A woman of the merchant class caught wearing silk might be forced to walk through the market barefoot in rags, her expensive clothes burned before the town. And God help you if you wore pearls without a family crest that was basically declaring war on the monarchy via necklace. And yes, there were actual fashion informants, snitches, people hired or self-appointed to patrol the streets and report offenders. Your hemline is 2 inches too lavish, madam. Those boots look suspiciously noble. Is that a jewelled belt? To the pillory. Imagine being hauled into court by a guy whose job is to stare at your socks. Welcome to medieval fashion law enforcement, where being stylish could get you legally stomped. But it wasn't just about clothing. Sumptuary laws also regulated food. Certain meat, spices and pastries were restricted to higher classes. Peasants weren't allowed to eat swan venison or anything with saffron. If a baker sold a forbidden pie to the wrong person, he could be fined, flogged or forced to eat his own crime in front of a crowd. One guy in France was punished for owning too much cheese. Too much cheese. The court called it culinary arrogance. And parties also regulated. Weddings had rules on how many guests, how much wine, what kind of music, and even the thread count on the napkins. Violating these standards could result in the entire family being fined or banned from future feasts. Imagine being blacklisted from medieval parties because your wedding had unauthorised drumming. That's not just petty. That's full-blown legislative pettiness in lace. The logic twisted as it was hinged on fear if the poor started looking like the rich, chaos would ensue. Class boundaries would blur. People might gasp, ask questions. So fashion was weaponised. You couldn't buy your way up. You had to be born into the right fabric. Velvet wasn't just a textile, it was a genealogical certificate with buttons. Ironically, the rich loved breaking the rules themselves. Nobles wore illegal patterns. Royals flaunted exotic furs. Kings gave forbidden fabrics as gifts. And what happened when they broke the law? Nothing. The same way a nobleman could commit murder and pay a fine, he could wear illegal gold embroidery and call it a bold personal choice. But if a peasant so much as looked fancy on a feast day, he risked flogging and poverty as punishment for not looking poor enough. Sometimes the punishment wasn't even legal, it was mob justice. A woman dressed too finely might get her clothes ripped off in the street by angry townsfolk yelling imposter or whore. Some were beaten. Others were stripped, marked with soot or ash, and dragged through town by their too fancy collars. The law encouraged it, because what's better than top-down enforcement? A little bit of chaos from the crowd. And let's not forget symbolic punishments. One man was caught impersonating a knight by wearing a tunic with silver trim. The court dressed him in a robe made of burlap and glued feathers to his sleeves, declaring him peacock of the gutter. He had to wear it for a week. Fashion shaming as judicial theatre. Honestly, that one's so extra it's almost iconic. So how did people survive this nonsense? Mostly through extreme caution and a lot of brown linen. Fashion creativity died in the lower classes. Peasants wore what they were told. Merchants tiptoed between legality and bankruptcy. And tailors lived in fear of selling the wrong outfit to the wrong client, lest their shop be burned down by angry sumptuary enforcers with tape measures and pitchforks. The church naturally backed all of it. Modesty, humility, hierarchy, they ate that stuff for breakfast. One bishop called silk a fabric of the devil's tongue. Another claimed coloured thread led to coloured thoughts. There were even sermons equating fashion with sin, as if your shoes might drag your soul to hell one ribbon at a time. But perhaps the strangest part of all this, these laws didn't even work. People still broke them. They dyed fabric in secret, smuggled silk, bribed tailors, sewed illegal linings into legal-looking garments. Because you can regulate clothing all you want, but you can't legislate envy or the need to look hot at market. Eventually, sumptuary laws faded, mostly because enforcement was exhausting, hypocritical, and deeply unpopular. But their spirit never really died. You still see echoes today in dress codes, in appropriate attire, in judgments passed when someone looks too rich or too poor in the wrong place. The medieval world just said it out loud. We control what you wear because we control who you are. So next time someone compliments your outfit, take a moment to appreciate the freedom. No fines, no flogging, no feathers glued to your armpits. Just you, your taste, and a closet not subject to royal interrogation. Fashion crimes. In the Middle Ages, they were real and they were punishable by pain, shame, and death. Justice in the Middle Ages was supposed to be blind, but don't be fooled. She wasn't blind. She was cross-eyed, greedy, and very open to bribes. The courtroom wasn't a sacred space of fairness. It was a medieval flea market where everything had a price tag. Freedom, silence, forgiveness, even your neighbour's land if you knew the right people. And justice was just another name for the guy holding out his hand and asking, "How badly do you want this to go away?" Let's cut the velvet curtain bribery was everywhere. Judges took it. Sheriffs demanded it. Constables expected it. Even the town hangman might pause mid-knot if you slipped him a coin, and a convincing story. People paid to avoid punishment. People paid to give punishment. And if you couldn't pay, well, hope you enjoyed the stocks, or the branding iron, or having your nose removed in the name of justice and moral hygiene. The whole system was pay to play. Caught stealing. That's a whipping, unless you offered the magistrate a goose, a bottle of mead and half a pig. Then it became a misunderstanding. Blasphemed in public, 10 lashes, unless your cousin was friends with the bishop's cook and could slip a gold ring under the communion table. Nepotism meet bribery, now kiss. Sometimes the price was official. Fines were tiered by crime and by who you were. If a noble killed a man, he paid a fee. If a peasant did the same, he was hanged. This wasn't law. This was a marketplace of morality with a sliding scale based on your last name. In Anglo-Saxon England, they even had set prices for injury known as the wergild or man price. Lose a finger, that's 3 shillings. Lose an ear, 5. Kill a noble. Better sell your farm, your family, and possibly your soul. Yes, they literally had body part price lists. Medieval law had receipts. Teeth, toes, testicles, every part of you had a market value. It was like shopping for body damage at a blacksmith's with a moral compass. Got stabbed in the thigh. There's a price for that. Broke someone's arm in a tavern fight, the court could calculate that down to the exact silver penny. If medieval legal documents had footnotes, they'd read like butcher's invoices. But the real magic happened behind closed doors. You didn't just bribe after you were accused, you bribed to avoid being accused at all. Want a neighbour framed. Want your debt forgotten. Want the local reeve to lose some paperwork. Crime as a service. Just ask politely and offer a bag of coins, a chicken, or access to your daughter's dowry. Sometimes people didn't even bother pretending. They walked into court and said, "What'll it cost to make this vanish?" And someone always had an answer. There were whole industries around this. Scribes forged documents. Guards accidentally left doors open. Priests wrote favourable testimonies in exchange for land or bread. You could even rent a witness, someone who'd swear they saw you at prayer instead of gutting a merchant by the river. Alibi for hire now with extra sanctimony. Corruption wasn't a glitch in the system. It was the system. Everyone knew it. No one stopped it. If anything, they participated. It was normal. Expected. If you didn't bribe someone now and then, people assumed you were either too stupid or too poor to survive. The question wasn't, is this fair? It was, how much can you afford to avoid fairness? And while peasants bled in the streets, nobles rewrote history with a kiss on the bishop's ring. They paid off verdicts, bought land from convicted traitors, married widows whose husbands had inconveniently drowned during an inquest. Every crime had a loophole. Every loop came with a price. Medieval lawyers weren't scholars, they were salesmen with parchment and plausible deniability. Sometimes the corruption was poetic. One man accused of arson bribed the judge by offering him the same house he'd supposedly burned. Another stole a pig, then donated half of it to the church. Instant absolution now with crispy skin. Want to avoid a heresy trial? Fund a new cathedral window. Want to unkill someone? Pay the family, pay the priest, pay the court clerk, and suddenly your murder becomes a blessed misunderstanding. Even the Inquisition, that terrifying theological monster, had its weak points. Heretics with cash often got lighter sentences. Nobles whispered into friars' ears. Monks received mysterious donations. If God's justice could be softened with silver, you can bet man's justice was practically on a clearance rack. And yes, the church itself was knee-deep in it. Indulgences were basically spiritual bribes. Pay a fee, skip some sin. The more you paid, the less your soul burned. Need a quick absolution? Throw a coin in the bowl. Want to commit adultery but stay on heaven's guest list? There's a form for that. God's forgiveness now available in small, medium and premium sinner packages. Of course, there were some crimes you couldn't bribe your way out of, usually ones that threatened people above you. Insult a noble, good luck. Steal from the bishop, get comfy with rats. But for everything else, justice was negotiable. In fact, not bribing someone might have made you suspicious. Why didn't he pay me off? Is he planning something? Not corrupting the system was a red flag. Sometimes bribes weren't even paid in money. They were favours, land, animals, sexual favours. A bribe could be a barrel of ale or a night with someone's daughter. And yes, there are recorded cases of young girls being traded to corrupt officials as gifts in exchange for favourable verdicts. That's not just corruption, that's systemic rot with a side of generational trauma. Want to avoid conscription, bribe the soldier. Want to get out of paying taxes, bribe the tax collector. Want your rival's barn to mysteriously burn down while the guards are looking the other way. You know what to do. Crime as a service wasn't whispered in shadows. It was part of the business model. Even punishment could be bought. If you were sentenced to flogging, a few extra coins might convince the constable to swing light or miss accidentally. Branding. Maybe it's done with a cold iron. Pillory time. Pay enough and you get the shady spot with soft ropes and no rotting tomatoes. Pain became optional. For the right price, justice didn't just look the other way, it winked at you while counting coins. This created a feedback loop. The poor got punished harder because they couldn't pay. The rich escaped because they could. And the middle class, they scraped together bribes with desperation, pawning heirlooms and livestock just to survive one mistake. The law wasn't protecting them. It was hunting them and selling exit routes like tickets to a game they couldn't afford to play. Worst of all, the people in power pretended it was all divinely ordained, that God wanted things this way, that inequality was holy, that paying your way out of justice was just the will of heaven expressed through economic hierarchy. No, Karen, that's not grace. It's a legalised shakedown. So yes, medieval justice was for sale. The price varied by crime, by class and by body part. It wasn't a system, it was a marketplace of suffering. And the only real law was this: the poor paid with flesh, the rich paid with coin, and everyone else just prayed they weren't next. Yes, you read that right. In the Middle Ages, you could be executed for singing. Not bad singing, not karaoke crimes against humanity, just singing. Because when life is miserable, the church is paranoid, and every other law is already insane, why not throw a little melodic murder into the mix? Now, to be fair, no one was going around executing children for humming lullabies or gutting choir boys mid-hymn. But if you sang the wrong kind of song in the wrong place to the wrong audience, boom, heresy, sedition, blasphemy, take your pick. You could end up in prison, in chains, or on fire. Because in the twisted theatre of medieval justice, even your voice wasn't safe. Let's talk about songs as dissent. In a time before newspapers, TikTok, or even widespread literacy songs were the viral tweets of the era. Want to insult the king but keep your head? Turn it into a drinking song. Want to mock the bishop? Wrap it in rhyme and sing it after your sixth ale. The people knew the game, but so did the authorities, and they hated it. In France, chansons subversive songs were officially banned. Singing them could get you flogged, exiled, or executed for treason. That's right. Medieval kings feared rhyming peasant ballads more than actual rebellions, because ballads were infectious. They spread. And once a joke about the crown made its way from tavern to market to monastery, the damage was done. But it wasn't just kings. The church had its own musical hit list. Sacred music was fine, Gregorian chants, psalms, angelic humming. But anything bawdy, comedic, or critical, straight to hell, or the dungeon, or the stake. One priest in Germany was excommunicated for singing a parody hymn that replaced Ave Maria with Ave Alea, praising beer instead of the Virgin Mary. Blasphemy by baritone. Then there were the travelling minstrels, medieval entertainers who lived by lute and wit. Beloved by peasants, feared by power. They'd roll into town, perform ballads about corrupt lords, mocking verses about tax collectors, or scathing rhymes about local clergy. And while villagers clapped and laughed, someone always listened with clenched fists and a scroll full of warrants. Minstrels were often arrested for stirring unrest. Some were banned from performing entirely. Others had their tongues cut out, a punishment not for speaking, but for singing truth too well. In one case, a minstrel was hanged for a song that jokingly referred to a nobleman as Lord Pignose of Greedy Hill. That's not an insult, that's art. But the nobleman didn't think so, and the court agreed. In England, singing seditious ballads could lead to branding or mutilation. One law declared that any person who utters rhyme against the king's honour shall have his tongue bored with hot iron. Imagine being so scared of a rhyme that you cook someone's mouth for it. That's not justice. That's a poetry critique from Satan. Even tavern songs weren't safe. Singing about cheating on your taxes, dangerous. A little ditty about the sheriff's wife, fatal. If someone reported it, and someone always did, you could be dragged from your stool and into court before the ale hit your bloodstream. One brewer's apprentice was whipped through town for singing a parody of a noble family's coat of arms, his crime lyrical sedition. And if you were caught singing during religious fasting days, you could be punished for joyful disrespect. That's right, being too happy was criminal. There are records of people being fined, flogged, even imprisoned for singing on saints' feast days with unholy rhythm. One woman in Spain was publicly shaved and paraded through town for singing and dancing during Lent, because nothing says piety like hair-based shame and a drum beat. And let's not forget the terrifying catch-all charge songs of the devil. If your tune sounded a little too catchy, a little too seductive, or used the wrong scale, boom. Possession, satanic influence, heresy via harmony. The church was constantly suspicious of music that moved the body. If your hips swayed, your soul was clearly in danger. Even dancing to someone else's singing could get you in trouble. Guilt by groove. In some cases, entire genres were banned. Secular love songs out. Pagan harvest tunes out. Anything with sexual innuendo, drinking references, or jokes about flatulence, definitely out. These weren't just naughty songs. They were seen as moral contagions, dangerous, uncontrollable, like a catchy sin that spread from ears to heart to eternal damnation. The punishment for song crimes varied, but it was never light. First-time offenders might get public penance, sackcloth, barefoot marching, maybe a fine. Second-time stocks branding or forced silence. Third-time death. One monk was burned alive for repeatedly singing verses that mocked church authority. His last words, "At least I die on key." Women who sang in public were especially vulnerable. Singing was seen as provocative, tempting, or outright sinful. A woman humming on her way to market might be accused of witchcraft. One widow in Scotland was drowned as a suspected witch, her only crime singing lullabies to her cat. I don't know what's more tragic, the sentence or the fact that no one even asked if the cat liked the tune. Children weren't immune either. Schoolboys caught singing lewd songs were whipped. Girls who hummed forbidden melodies were punished for courting the devil with their tongues. In some regions, parents were fined if their children sang songs not approved by the local clergy. So not only did your kid's bedtime jingle need to be off-key, it also needed a stamp of approval from the church. Hush, little baby, don't say a word, unless it's doctrinally approved and reviewed by the abbot. And of course, some songs weren't even real. All it took was a rumour. I heard she sings sinful things at night. He hums while walking past the chapel. No evidence, no lyrics, just hearsay. And suddenly you're standing in court with a hood over your head, and your life hanging by a chorus. Because in the Middle Ages, silence was safety and melody was madness. To be fair, not everyone enforced these laws equally. Some towns loved music. Some lords kept bards on payroll. But even in those cases, musicians knew they were one lyric away from losing everything. A court jester could mock anyone until the punchline landed too close to the truth. A ballad could entertain crowds until it echoed the wrong rumour. And the most absurd part, this didn't end quickly. People were still being punished for musical expression deep into the Renaissance. One Italian man was imprisoned in the 1600s for composing a folk song that allegedly undermined clerical dignity with excessive rhythm. Imagine being jailed because your beat slapped too hard. So yes, execution for singing wasn't just possible, it was real and terrifying. In a world where everything you said could be twisted into sedition, turning your words into melody just made the noose come with background vocals. Next time you sing in the shower, hum in the car, or whistle down the hallway, take a moment to remember you're not on trial for it. No gallows, no fire, no tongue clamp, Just you, your voice, and the miracle of not living in a time where harmony could literally kill you. Medieval justice didn't just want your silence. It demanded it in every key. So you've just been sentenced to death in medieval court. Maybe you stole a loaf of bread, insulted a bishop, or wore purple without a crown. But wait, you have a good excuse. You want to appeal. You want a retrial. A second chance. Too bad. In the Middle Ages, your right to appeal came with one small catch. You had to survive the punishment first, and most people didn't. The appeal process existed technically, but in the same way a unicorn technically exists if someone's drunk enough. Justice wasn't designed to be corrected. It was designed to be inflicted, and if you were lucky enough to get an appeal, chances are you were already missing a limb, dignity, or pulse. Let's start with the basics. Appeals weren't automatic. You didn't get to shout objection and wait for a judge to bang his gavel. First of all, there was no gavel. There was usually a man with a stick and a bad attitude. Second, the court often ended with, "We've heard enough. Bring the rope." You could beg all you wanted, but unless you had a letter from the king or an angel with a flaming sword, that verdict was sticking. But let's say by some miracle you did get an appeal. You had to submit a petition, often in Latin, written by a scribe you couldn't afford, addressed to someone who didn't care. The odds of success were lower than a rat surviving a soup kitchen. Most petitions weren't read. Some were tossed in the fire. Others were used to wipe ink-stained fingers. Bureaucracy, thy name is pointless suffering. And who reviewed appeals? Higher courts, royal courts, ecclesiastical courts. Courts where the judges were often the same people who passed the original sentence. It's like getting punched in the face and then asking the same fist if it made a mistake. Spoiler, it didn't. It's very proud of itself. In some cases, appeals took years. Literal years. People rotted in prison while their case bounced around from one indifferent noble to another. And if you died in the meantime, well, now it's posthumous justice time. That's right, your appeal could still go through. And if you were declared innocent after your death, they might let your family bury you in real dirt instead of the pit behind the gallows. Sometimes, if a sentence was clearly botched, say you were hanged for a crime, someone else confessed to the court would respond with overwhelming compassion and a polite shrug. Too late now, they'd say. Mistakes were made. Moving on. And they did, usually to lunch, with no refund, no apology, and no explanation. In England, if you wanted to appeal a verdict, you could request a writ of error, a fancy legal document that basically meant, oops, I think the court messed up. But the process cost more than most peasants made in a lifetime. You needed a seal, a scribe, a bribe, a lord's approval, a spare goose, and possibly a minor miracle. By the time your paperwork was approved, your bones had already been picked clean by crows. But appeals weren't just about legal error. Sometimes people appealed on moral grounds. I didn't mean to. I was drunk. I thought it was my goat. These defences usually failed unless, of course, you were a rich noble or had slept with someone important. Then the court might say, "You rascal," and reduce your sentence from execution to exile, which was basically execution but colder. There were even appeal attempts made while being executed. People begged on the scaffold. Some screamed confessions. Others denied everything, hoping a last-minute pardon would descend from the heavens or from a sweaty messenger on horseback. And sometimes, very rarely, it did. But more often than not, the axe fell before the ink dried. One of the most absurd aspects of medieval justice was the reversal of verdicts after death. Kings and popes occasionally changed their minds decades later. Actually, we decided he wasn't a heretic. Oops. They'd dig up the body, give it a proper burial, and pretend that made everything better. In some cases, they'd even hold a new trial for a corpse. Yes, a literal dead body propped up in court like a decaying defendant in a tragic comedy. Joan of Arc tried, executed, burned alive. Then, 25 years later, oopsie innocent all along, and the church gave her a retrial, a posthumous retrial, with lawyers, witnesses, documents, for a woman whose ashes had already been scattered. That's not justice. That's a guilt-fueled PR campaign. The same happened with Pope Formosus in the infamous Cadaver Synod. He was dead, rotting, already buried. But his enemies were so angry they dug him up, dressed him in papal robes, put him on a throne and held a trial, a literal corpse on trial. He was found guilty, his 3 fingers of benediction were chopped off, and his body was tossed into the river. Medieval appeals were less about law and more about grudge-fueled necromancy. And let's not forget the benefit of clergy loophole. If you could read a single verse from the Bible, you could claim to be a cleric and escape execution. Some convicts memorized one line just in case. Others had a scribe whisper it to them like a cheat code. The Lord is my shepherd, yes. That's Psalm 23, I'm a priest, now cancel the hanging. And sometimes it worked, because literacy was seen as divine. But if you were a literate poor foreign or just had the wrong haircut, tough luck. No appeals for you. Just a rough ride to the gallows, a last prayer optional, and a quick drop into judicial oblivion. The law didn't protect the weak. It swallowed them, digested them, and called it holy. So why even have appeals at all? Simple, they made the system look civilized, like sprinkling sugar on spoiled meat. See, we have a process. We respect justice. Meanwhile, the appeals process worked about as often as a catapult made of cheese. And if you did win, great. Now go home with your bruises, your trauma, and your freedom, which was basically the right to be poor again. In the end, appeals in the Middle Ages weren't about fairness. They were about appearances. A broken machine pretending to self-correct. And the few who made it through survivors of luck, influence and blackmail, not justice. So next time your parking ticket gets reviewed or your tax audit gets delayed, just remember at least your appeals don't involve grave digging a Latin verse or arguing your case while dangling from a rope. Because in the Middle Ages, justice didn't say you have the right to a fair appeal. It said you have the right to scream before we make you a legal footnote. So after 19 chapters of blood chains, burning, gagging, bribery and execution by song, you might be wondering, did medieval justice ever get better? Or are we just a few plague outbreaks away from going full scold's bridle again? Well, good news, it did improve. A little. Like barely. But enough to say we eventually started using actual laws instead of just mood swings and pitchforks. Welcome to the slow, halting crawl of progress, a candle in the dungeon. Change didn't come fast. It didn't come from kings either. It came from suffering. So much suffering. Revolts, uprisings, people realizing that maybe executing someone for wearing the wrong colour or whistling on a Tuesday was a bit much. Justice started moving from the gallows to the page from torture devices to written law, where at least the torture had to follow a formal process. One of the first flickers of hope, the Magna Carta 1215. Yeah, the one every bored student had to memorise for history class. Turns out it actually mattered. It forced the king, well, sort of forced to accept that maybe he shouldn't imprison or execute people just because. It introduced the wild, radical idea that law should apply even to royalty. Baby steps, but crucial ones. Then came the rise of parliaments, juries, and something vaguely resembling due process. Courts started requiring witness testimony. Trials became less about spectacle and more about structured accusation. And while corruption still oozed from every corner, it had to wear a wig and pretend to be respectable now. Justice didn't improve because people got kinder. It improved because people got organised. Printing presses changed the game. Suddenly laws could be distributed, read, debated. Peasants still couldn't afford books, but scholars could. Activists could. And over time, people started asking dangerous questions like, why exactly is singing a death sentence? Or should we really execute people for talking during Lent? These weren't revolutions, but they were drips on stone, and stone cracks. Lawyers started becoming a real profession. No longer just scribes or family friends with good Latin, they became advocates, interpreters of law. Sometimes rarely they even fought for people who weren't rich. The idea of defence entered the scene. Instead of one-sided guilt, parades, trials became debates. Not always fair, not always kind, but more layered than bring the rope. Punishment slowly shifted too. Executions dropped for minor crimes. Flogging declined. Branks and scolds' bridles were seen less frequently. Branding fell out of fashion. Prisons became the new trend with bars instead of blades, confinement instead of death. Not better in all ways, but a step up from "we'll burn your soul clean through your feet." By the Renaissance, there were murmurs of human rights, though no one used that phrase yet. Philosophers started asking if maybe, just maybe, people had value beyond land ownership or divine birth. Thinkers like Locke, Montesquieu, and eventually Rousseau laid the foundation for modern justice systems. You know, the kind where your trial doesn't involve water torture and a talking corpse. Religion, once the iron glove of medieval punishment, slowly loosened its grip. The church lost its monopoly over morality. Secular courts gained strength. Heresy trials became rarer. Burning people for having opinions was downgraded from mandatory to optional. And finally to maybe don't. It wasn't enlightenment. But it was something close to the hallway outside Enlightenment's bathroom. Even monarchs began embracing reform. Not out of kindness, of course, out of fear. Because if they didn't reform, the people would eventually just start lopping off heads. Ask the French, or the English, or literally anyone from the 17th century. Justice has to evolve or risk becoming the reason people stormed palaces with pitchforks and a grudge. By the 18th century, the death penalty was still around, but mostly for major crimes. Stealing a loaf of bread might get you prison time instead of decapitation. Singing a rude song about the king might get you fined, not burned. Courts, actual courts, were taking shape. Trials had records. Juries had instructions. Evidence started mattering more than rumours and pork bribes. Sure, there was still racism, classism, sexism, brutality, corruption, and there still is. But the idea that justice should be more than revenge wrapped in robes started catching on. Slowly. Painfully. But it stuck. Fast forward to today, we have appeals, public defenders, human rights declarations, court reporters who type every word, judges who can be removed for misconduct, laws that sometimes protect the innocent. Is the system perfect? Absolutely not. But compared to the Middle Ages, it's a spa day. Today you don't get executed for singing, or wearing the wrong hat, or being sarcastic during Mass. You don't need to bribe someone to avoid being tortured for being too cheerful. You can criticise the king, the church, and even the legal system itself without being dragged through the streets in a cage made of shame and iron. That's not nothing, that's a win. And it happened because people suffered, remembered, and said, never again. Because every generation someone asked, is this justice, or just cruelty in a robe? And someone else answered, let's make it better. So we did. Tiny candles, flickering in the dark, burning away centuries of pain, one reform at a time. And as long as we keep asking, keep watching, keep remembering what justice once looked like when it wore a hood and carried a rusty blade, maybe we'll keep that candle burning. Because if the Middle Ages taught us anything, it's this. Justice isn't justice unless it applies to everyone, equally, loudly, and without a brank strapped to your face.